There is a particular kind of man that war produces, not the kind written about in school lessons or carved into statues, but the kind forged in genuine catastrophe, in the collapse of everything orderly and expected. A man who does not rise because the conditions were favorable, but precisely because they were not. A man whose greatness is inseparable from the worst suffering his civilization ever endured. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was that man. He was born in a village so small and so forgotten that most maps of Russia never bothered to include it. He grew up without privilege, without connections, without the aristocratic bloodline that the old Russian military order demanded of its leaders. He was the son of a tailor. He wore boots that did not fit. And yet, before the middle of the 20th century had even arrived, this same man would stand at the center of the largest land war in the history of human civilization, not as a spectator, not as a diplomat, not as a political appointee, but as the single most decisive military mind the conflict would produce. That is not a small claim. Sit with it for a moment. The Second World War touched every corner of the earth. It generated commanders of genuine brilliance, men studied in academies to this day, men whose names carry an almost mythological weight. And yet when historians strip away the mythology, when they look at raw scale, at the complexity of the operations planned, at the number of soldiers commanded, at the territory liberated, and the enemy forces destroyed, one name rises above the rest, with a consistency that is difficult to argue with. A peasant boy from a village outside Moscow, a man who was nearly purged, nearly irrelevant, nearly erased from history, before history had even given him his moment. The story of Georgy Zhukov is not a simple story of triumph. That is precisely what makes it worth telling. It is a story about a system that nearly destroyed its own best instrument, a paranoid dictatorship that executed its finest military minds in the years immediately before the greatest military test in its existence. It is a story about a man navigating that system with extraordinary pragmatic intelligence, surviving when nearly every contemporary did not, and then, when the moment demanded it, performing at a level that defied what any reasonable person might have expected of the institution that had raised him. It is a story about the relationship between individual genius and institutional catastrophe. What happens when one man genuinely understands something about warfare that the people around him, including the man with absolute power over his life, simply do not? It is also a story about the price of victory. The Soviet Union's triumph over Nazi Germany was absolute. It was also the most expensive human achievement in recorded history. More than 25 million Soviet citizens dead, cities erased, families dissolved into ash and absence. When Zhukov's forces finally raised their flag over the ruins of Berlin in the spring of 1945, they were raising it over the wreckage of a world that could never be entirely put back together. Understanding what that victory cost, and understanding Zhukov's role not merely in winning it, but in shaping every strategic decision that built toward it, requires a certain willingness to sit with difficult things, to resist the temptation to reduce it to heroics. We are not going to reduce it to heroics. What we are going to do, over the course of this documentary, is follow Zhukov from his very beginning, from that small village, from those ill-fitting boots and modest circumstances, all the way through to the end of his life, which came quietly in 1974, in a Soviet Union that had spent decades trying to decide how much credit it was willing to give the man who had saved it. We are going to follow him through the cavalry charges of the First World War and the violent political reckonings of revolution. We are going to follow him to the Mongolian steppe, where in 1939 he delivered a shock to Japanese military planning that would reverberate all the way to the decisions made at Pearl Harbor. We are going to sit with him in the catastrophic summer of 1941, when Germany's invasion shattered Soviet defenses on a scale that still strains comprehension, and watch how he responded, not with panic, but with the particular cold clarity that defined everything he did. We will walk through the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. We will stand at the edge of the Kursk salient, where the largest armored engagement in history unfolded, across summer fields, and changed the direction of the entire war. We will trace the enormous arc of the Soviet counteroffensives, operations named for old Russian heroes, executed with a scale of planning and logistics that modern military thinkers still analyze, as Zhukov and his colleagues drove the Wehrmacht westward kilometer by kilometer, front by front, city by city, until Berlin itself fell. And then we will reckon with what came after, because one of the strangest and most human chapters in Zhukov's story is not a battle at all. It is the peculiar punishment that awaited him once the fighting was done, the systematic sidelining, the quiet political exile, the Soviet state's determination to ensure that no single figure could accumulate the kind of popular prestige that might one day challenge the authority of the men who had merely survived the war rather than won it. The man who defeated Nazi Germany would spend years commanding obscure military districts far from Moscow, erased from official narratives by the same machinery he had spent his entire career faithfully serving. That tension between what Zhukov achieved and how his own country chose to remember him is perhaps the most revealing thing about him, and about the system that made him. If you are new here, this is exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel. Long, complete, carefully researched histories of the figures and forces that shaped the world we live in, told with the kind of patience and depth that the subject genuinely deserves. If that is what you are looking for, now is a very good time to subscribe. Every week, we build on these stories, and each one fits into a larger picture of the 20th century that becomes more illuminating the more of it you hold in your mind at once. And if you have been here before, welcome back. Settle in, find a comfortable position. The story we are about to tell runs from the final years of Imperial Russia all the way through the Cold War, and it does not rush, it does not need to. The life of Georgy Zhukov is long enough and layered enough that every chapter of it earns its time. This is the complete history of the man the Red Army called its hammer, the peasant's son who became the Soviet Union's greatest military mind, the general who stood at the intersection of the worst catastrophe of the 20th century and refused, again and again, to let it be the final word. This is the story of Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. There is a village in Kaluga Oblast, southwest of Moscow, so small and so ordinary that it barely registers against the vast indifference of the Russian countryside. Its name is Strelkovka. In the final years of the 19th century, it was a place of unpaved tracks, low timber houses, and fields that demanded everything from the people who worked them and gave back just enough to keep them alive. It was not a place that announced destiny. It was not a place that produced commanders or conquerors or men whose names would one day be carved into the stone of monuments. It was a place where people were born, worked until their bodies gave out, and died within sight of the same horizon their parents had known. And yet, in the year 1894, in this unremarkable cluster of houses and hardship, a boy was born who would one day stand above the ruins of Berlin and accept the surrender of the most formidable military machine in European history. His name was Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, and nothing about his beginning suggested what his ending would be. His father, Konstantin, was a cobbler and occasional tailor. a man of skilled hands and limited means, working in a trade that kept the family from the very bottom of rural poverty, but placed them nowhere near its top. His mother, Ustinia, kept the household and worked the land when the seasons demanded it, as women in such villages always did. The Zhukov home was small, heated by a wood stove, and shared between family members in the way that poverty organizes people into close quarters, whether they choose it or not. Georgy was the second child, arriving into a world that offered him few material comforts and made no promises. Rural Russia in the 1890s was a society arranged by hierarchy as deliberately as a military formation, the aristocracy at its summit, the peasantry at its base, and a vast, largely invisible gulf between them that few crossed in a single lifetime. To be born in Strelkovka was to be born on the bottom rung, and the ladder was not designed for climbing. The education available to a boy of Zhukov's background was functional rather than enriching. A parish school where reading and basic arithmetic were taught with more devotion to discipline than to curiosity. Yet Zhukov absorbed what was offered and sought more than what was given. Those who later described his early character reached for the same cluster of words: determined, serious, stubborn, in the way that quiet children sometimes are, carrying their ambitions below the surface where they cannot be challenged or mocked. Russia at the turn of the 20th century was not an environment that rewarded visible ambition in peasant boys. You learned early to keep your calculations private. You learned that the world would not rearrange itself to suit your desires, and so you arranged yourself to suit the world, while watching for the moment when the arrangement might shift. Zhukov was watching from the beginning, even if neither he nor anyone around him could have named what he was watching for. At roughly the age of 11, he was sent to Moscow to apprentice with a furrier, his mother's brother, a man with a trade workshop in the city. This was not unusual for boys of his background. The village could not support everyone it produced, and the city, vast and indifferent and full of noise, absorbed the surplus of the countryside in workshops and factories and trades. Moscow in the early 1900s was a city in the grip of transformation, old empire pressing against new industry, the streets thick with horse-drawn carts and the first mechanical vehicles, with the shouting of merchants and the silence of the very poor moving alongside each other without touching. For a boy from Strelkovka, it was another education entirely, not formal, not organized, but relentlessly instructive. The city taught Zhukov that scale was possible, that things could be bigger, faster, more complex than anything the village had shown him. It planted in him an appetite for understanding how large things worked. The furrier's workshop demanded long hours and offered little in the way of comfort or elevation, but Zhukov did not stop educating himself. He attended evening classes when he could, studying with the focus of someone who understood that knowledge was not a luxury for people in his position but a tool, perhaps the only tool available to him that the social order could not confiscate. He read, he thought, he observed the structure of the city and the structure of the workshop with the same attention, learning in both cases how authority operated, how orders moved from one level to the next, how systems either held together or came apart. These were not lessons he could have articulated at the time. They were simply the sediment of observation, accumulating quietly in a young man who had nowhere to spend his attention except inward. Then came 1914, and the world that had seemed so fixed and permanent revealed itself as something far more fragile. The Great War arrived with the particular violence of a catastrophe that no one in power had genuinely expected to be catastrophic. For millions of young men across Russia and across Europe, the summer of 1914 ended one kind of life and began another that most of them had not chosen. Zhukov was conscripted into the Imperial Russian Army in 1915, swept into the enormous and chaotic machinery of a military organization that was attempting to fight a modern industrial war, with a system still organized around assumptions of the previous century. He was 20 years old. He was assigned to the cavalry, the branch that, in the minds of the Imperial High Command, still represented the decisive arm of warfare, even as the machine gun and artillery barrage were methodically proving otherwise. The cavalry of the Imperial Russian Army in the First World War was a study in the collision between romantic military tradition and brutal modern reality. The horse soldier had been the dominant force on European battlefields for centuries, and the men who designed the Russian order of battle were, in many cases, men who had grown up revering that tradition and who could not quite bring themselves to accept that it had been made obsolete almost overnight. Zhukov arrived into this contradiction and spent his early military months observing it with the same careful attention he had applied to everything before. He was not a man who appears to have been swept up in romantic notions of cavalry glory. He was a man who watched how things actually worked and filed the information away for later. His conduct in the field was noticed. He was promoted from the enlisted ranks, an achievement that in the rigidly hierarchical imperial army was not impossible for a man of his background, but was far from automatic and required visible competence of an order that could not be conveniently ignored. He was awarded the Cross of St. George on 2 separate occasions during his service in the First World War, a decoration granted for personal bravery in combat. The citations that accompanied these awards described a soldier who acted with initiative under pressure, a quality that was rarer than valor itself because it required not just courage but judgment, the ability to assess a situation clearly while everything around you demanded panic. Zhukov, even then, was constitutionally incapable of the kind of mental surrender that panic requires. His mind, under pressure, appears to have sharpened rather than blurred. The war taught him things that no textbook could have provided. He watched the catastrophic failures of the Imperial Command, the supply breakdowns, the tactical rigidity, the profound disconnect between the men who planned operations from distant headquarters and the men who executed them in mud and blood. He watched the way that large military organizations could be rendered helpless not by the enemy's strength, but by their own internal dysfunction, their own inability to process reality and respond to it. He watched, and he remembered. These were lessons that would take years to fully surface in his practice, but they were being stored with the precision of a man who had learned early that nothing observed is wasted, because you rarely know in advance which piece of information will one day become essential. The revolution of 1917 reached him while he was still in uniform, one of millions of Russian soldiers suddenly confronted with the dissolution of the authority structure that had placed them in the field to begin with. The Tsar abdicated. The provisional government struggled and fell. The Bolsheviks seized power with the confidence of people who believed they understood history's direction. For men like Zhukov, the choice was not necessarily ideological in the first instance. It was practical. The imperial army was dissolving. The new order was offering structure, purpose, and the continuation of a military career to men who had demonstrated competence. He joined the Red Army. He stepped from one world into another, carrying with him the skills, the observations, and the hard-formed instincts that 2 years of genuine warfare had pressed into him. What is striking, looking back at the young Zhukov of these early years, is not the presence of genius, but the accumulation of preparation. He was not born exceptional in any circumstance that his birth provided. The Zainzhov Strelkovka offered no advantages, no connections, no inherited authority. The furrier's workshop in Moscow offered labor and survival, not elevation. Even the imperial army, for all that it gave him in experience, was not designed to produce great commanders from the peasant class. It was designed to keep them capable enough to be useful and subordinate enough not to be threatening. What Zhukov did with every environment he passed through was extract its maximum instruction and internalize it without sentiment. He did not idealize the cavalry or mourn the Tsar or cling to any version of the world that was passing. He moved with the current of history, but he moved deliberately, with his eyes open and his mind already calculating the next position. The boy from Strelkovka was becoming something that Strelkovka had never intended to produce. The process would take decades more to complete. But it had begun, in the fields and the workshop and the trenches, as quietly and as surely as the accumulation of everything that eventually becomes unstoppable. He was 19 years old when the empire came for him, not with a letter, not with a choice, but with a conscription notice pressed into hands still calloused from cobbling leather in his uncle's workshop in Moscow. The year was 1914, and across Europe the great powers were assembling their armies with the quiet confidence of men who had never seen what modern artillery could do to a human body. Russia mobilized millions in the name of the Tsar, and Georgy Zhukov, peasant-born, barely educated, already toughened by years of labor far from home, was swept into that tide like a stone lifted off a riverbed. He had no particular love for the empire that had given his family so little, but he had no choice, and perhaps more than that, no fear. Something in him responded to the structure of military life, to the clarity of rank and command, to a world where competence could outrun the accident of birth. He was assigned to the cavalry, and whatever the army intended for him, what it got back was considerably more than it bargained for. The cavalry of the Imperial Russian Army was, by 1914, already a relic pretending to be a weapon. It had been bred on Napoleonic imagination, the thundering charge, the decisive pursuit, the shock of horses and steel, but the war it rode into was something altogether different. The Western Front had shown what machine guns and barbed wire could accomplish against mounted men, and the Eastern Front, while more fluid, was conducting its own education in modern killing. Zhukov learned to ride, and he learned well. He learned to move across terrain at speed, to scout, to communicate, and to adapt when the ground changed beneath you without warning. But he also learned something more durable, that the cavalry doctrine he had been handed was built on assumptions the war was systematically destroying. Every charge that faltered, every patrol cut down by fire that came from a direction no one had anticipated, deposited a lesson in his mind that he would carry for the rest of his life. He was not yet an officer when the war began. He was a private, indistinguishable from the tens of thousands of young men feeding themselves into the machinery of the Eastern Front. But he was observant in a way that set him apart from those around him, and he was capable, physically capable, analytically capable, and possessed of the peculiar calm that separates men who function under pressure from those who merely survive it. He was wounded. He suffered alongside everyone else. He endured the particular misery of Russian imperial logistics, which managed simultaneously to be vast in scope and catastrophically inadequate in delivery. Soldiers froze for want of coats, went hungry for want of supply trains, fought with rifles they couldn't reload because the ammunition had been sent to the wrong front. All of this Zhukov absorbed without breaking. He noted what failed and why, and filed it somewhere that would prove useful later. By the time he reached the rank of non-commissioned officer, the war had already begun its slow work of dismantling the world he had been born into. The Russian Imperial Army, bleeding across a front of staggering length, was beginning to buckle not only militarily but psychologically. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers. Officers lost the confidence of their men and in some cases lost their lives to the men they commanded. The social compact between the Tsar and his conscripts, always thin, always conditional, was tearing open under the weight of casualties that had no visible purpose and victories that never arrived cleanly enough to justify the price. Zhukov could read the mood in the barracks as easily as he could read ground from horseback. Something was coming apart, and no amount of imperial proclamation was going to reassemble it. Then came 1917, and the world came apart entirely. The February Revolution stripped the Tsar of his throne and handed Russia to a provisional government that satisfied almost no one. By October, Lenin and the Bolsheviks had seized power in Petrograd, and the empire that had conscripted Georgy Zhukov 3 years earlier ceased to exist. For millions of soldiers still nominally at war, the question became immediate and personal. What side do you stand on? Many officers of the old army fled. Many chose the white cause, the counter-revolutionary movement that would convulse Russia for years in civil war. Some simply walked away and went home. Zhukov chose differently. He chose the Red Army, the Bolshevik force that was less an army at that moment than an armed political aspiration, desperately short of experienced men and long on revolutionary fervor. It was not a romantic choice. It was a calculated one. His motivations deserve examination, because they were not simple. There was ideology in the mix. Zhukov came from poverty, and the Bolshevik promise of a world reorganized in favor of people like him carried genuine weight. But ideology alone does not explain the consistency and longevity of his commitment. Zhukov understood, with the instinct of a man who had watched power operate from the bottom of it, that the Bolsheviks were going to win. They controlled the cities, the communications, and the political momentum. The whites were fragmented, foreign-backed, and burdened by their association with the system that had already failed. To join the Red Army was to bet on the future, and Zhukov was not a man who bet against momentum. He volunteered his cavalry skills, his experience, his capacity to lead, and the Red Army, hungry for precisely those things, accepted him. The Russian Civil War that followed was nothing like the war he had just survived. It was mobile, brutal, and intensely political in ways that the Imperial War had never been. Cavalry mattered again, not in the doomed Napoleonic sense, but in the sense of speed and disruption, of cutting supply lines and appearing where the enemy did not expect you. Zhukov proved himself repeatedly in this environment. He demonstrated tactical flexibility, the ability to read engagements in real time and adjust, and perhaps most critically, the ability to work within a command structure that was ideologically charged and deeply suspicious of professional military men who had served the old regime. He was one of those men, and he knew it. He conducted himself accordingly, loyal, reliable, careful in what he said, precise in what he delivered. Navigating the early Red Army required more than battlefield skill. It required a particular kind of political literacy that Zhukov developed the way he developed everything else, through observation, through caution, and through the cultivation of results that made him difficult to dismiss. The factionalism within Soviet military life was severe, and the punishment for misjudging it could be instant and lethal. Commanders who expressed the wrong opinion, associated with the wrong political figures, or failed at the wrong moment, did not simply lose their commands. They lost their freedom, and sometimes their lives. Zhukov understood this not as an injustice to be resisted, but as a terrain feature to be navigated. He kept his opinions close, built his reputation on operational success, and made himself useful to whichever senior figure could extend protection and opportunity. It was not cowardice. It was the survival instinct of a man who understood the system he was operating inside. Through the 1920s, as the Soviet Union consolidated under Lenin and then began its uneasy transition towards Stalin's ascendancy, Zhukov continued to rise. He studied. This is worth dwelling on. He studied with a seriousness that his origins did not guarantee. He read military theory. He examined the campaigns of history. He engaged with the emerging Soviet doctrine of deep battle operations that theorists were developing around him. The Red Army of the 1920s was, in certain respects, an intellectually fervent institution. It was arguing loudly about the future of warfare, about the role of armor, about the relationship between infantry and mechanized forces, about the depth at which operations should be conducted. Zhukov sat inside that argument and drew his own conclusions. He was not a theorist by temperament. He was a practitioner, but he understood theory well enough to know which ideas were worth keeping. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, his career had assumed a trajectory that distinguished him from most men of his background. He had survived the transition from empire to revolution, from civil war to institutional peacetime. He had accumulated experience across cavalry operations and the complex political dynamics of a military embedded in an ideological state. He had, perhaps most valuably, developed the habit of outcome, of focusing relentlessly on what needed to be achieved and subordinating everything else to that aim. Other officers around him were being consumed by politics, by personal rivalries, by ideological arguments that could turn fatal without warning. Zhukov's protection was his competence, deployed consistently enough to make him a resource rather than a threat. But the system he served was growing darker. Stalin's consolidation of power was not a gradual shift in tone. It was a systematic dismantling of anyone who might compete with him, combined with a terror so vast and indiscriminate that even the loyal and the useful were not safe. The purges of the 1930s would reach into the officer corps of the Red Army with devastating force. The men who had built the institution, who had developed its doctrine, who had commanded its formations, they would be called traitors and shot, or sent to camps from which many never returned. Zhukov would survive this, but not quite yet. That story belongs to the years ahead, and to the assignment that would take him far from Moscow, far from the reach of the machinery consuming his colleagues, and deep into a different kind of war entirely. For now he was a cavalry officer turned Red Army commander, a man forged by the futility of one war and the ferocity of another, practical, unsentimental, and entirely capable of becoming something history had not yet found a name for. While Stalin's Russia braced itself for a storm it did not yet see coming, Georgy Zhukov found himself pointed in an entirely different direction. The 1930s were a decade of dangerous currents, political, military, ideological, and for a Red Army officer of his rank and ambition, the wrong step in any direction could be fatal. Yet Zhukov, whether by design, by luck, or by some combination of both, that history rarely troubles to separate, ended up far from Moscow when the worst of it began. He was sent east, not to a front, not to a prison, but to China, a country convulsing under Japanese pressure and desperate for any expertise it could borrow. His assignment as a military advisor placed him in the company of a foreign war he had not chosen, watching a conflict he did not control, learning lessons that would one day cost Germany everything. The Japanese military machine had been moving across northeastern China since the early part of that decade. What had begun as opportunism in Manchuria, a region rich in resources and strategically positioned against both Chinese nationalism and Soviet expansion, had hardened into something more systematic and more brutal. Japan was not merely occupying territory, it was absorbing it, restructuring it, fortifying it, and using it as a staging ground for ambitions that stretched further than any map in Moscow or Beijing could comfortably contain. The Chinese forces struggling to resist this expansion were vast in number, but fractured in command, poorly supplied, and operating with doctrine that had not yet absorbed the lessons that mechanized warfare was already teaching across Europe. They needed advisors. They needed someone who could look at a deteriorating front and speak honestly about what it would take to hold it. Zhukov was that kind of man. His role placed him close enough to the fighting to understand it without being consumed by it. He was an observer with rank, a man who could request briefings, study terrain, watch how armored formations moved across open ground, and then step back and think about what it all meant in a larger sense. The Japanese army he was studying was not a theoretical opponent. It was a functioning, experienced force that had absorbed the lessons of the Russo-Japanese War from 4 decades earlier and had continued evolving. Its infantry was disciplined to a degree that bordered on fanatical. Its logistics were organized around speed and consolidation rather than the slow grinding advance that the previous century had made familiar. And its commanders moved with an aggression that combined tactical boldness with strategic patience, a combination that many Western-trained officers of that era struggled to properly diagnose. Zhukov was diagnosing it carefully. What he observed in China would not simply stay in China. Every note, every conclusion, every hard observation about how armored units integrated with air support, how supply chains could either enable or strangle an offensive, how terrain shaped the difference between encirclement and escape. All of it was being processed through a mind that was already formidable and becoming more so with each passing month. He had entered the cavalry tradition of the Imperial Army and survived revolution to reach the Red Army. He had watched, in the years since, how Soviet military doctrine had tried to absorb the lessons of industrial war without always succeeding. What he was seeing in northeastern China confirmed certain fears and gave shape to certain convictions that he had been carrying for years. Speed mattered. Coordination between arms, infantry, armor, artillery, air, was not a theoretical ideal, but a practical requirement. And the side that concentrated overwhelming force at the decisive point, at the decisive moment, would almost always determine the outcome before the enemy had fully understood what was happening. But while Zhukov watched a war in China and built the intellectual architecture that would later define his own command decisions, something monstrous was unfolding at home. Stalin's Great Purge, that catastrophic wave of arrests, trials, confessions, extracted under duress, and executions, was consuming the Soviet officer corps with an appetite that bordered on self-destruction. The men who had built the Red Army, who had survived civil war and foreign intervention, who had spent years developing doctrine and training institutions and organizational frameworks, were being taken away in the night. Some were shot within days of their arrest. Others disappeared into the camp system and were never heard from again. The charges were almost universally fabricated: treason, sabotage, collaboration with foreign powers, participation in conspiracies that existed only in the paranoid imagination of a state apparatus that had learned to feed on its own. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, perhaps the most intellectually gifted military theorist the Red Army had produced in its short existence, was arrested in the spring of 1937. He was accused of plotting with foreign powers, accusations assembled from forged documents and extracted confessions. He was executed within weeks of his arrest. he was not alone. Across the officer corps, men who had served, studied, and sacrificed for the Soviet state found themselves destroyed by it. By the time the purge had run the worst of its course, the Red Army had lost the overwhelming majority of its most experienced senior commanders. Entire layers of institutional knowledge vanished. Younger officers who had barely consolidated their own experience were suddenly promoted into positions that required judgment built over decades. The damage to Soviet military readiness was incalculable, and it would be paid for in blood when Germany came. Zhukov was not in Moscow when any of this happened. He was not attending the meetings where names were floated and fates quietly decided. He was not present at the gatherings where denunciations could be dropped into the wrong ears. Distance is not the same as innocence, and it is not the same as virtue. But in the political mathematics of Stalinist Russia, distance was often the only factor standing between a man and annihilation. His assignment abroad placed him outside the social ecosystem in which the purge operated most lethally. He could not be seen at the wrong dinner table. He could not be heard making the wrong comment in the wrong corridor. He was simply elsewhere, which in that particular historical moment amounted to a kind of accidental salvation. There is no evidence that Zhukov engineered his absence specifically to survive the purge. He was a soldier, not a political schemer, and the assignment to China came through channels that had more to do with his demonstrated competence than with any survival calculation on his part. But history does not always separate the intentional from the fortunate. What matters is that when he returned to the Soviet Union, he returned to a military institution that had been bled nearly dry of its most capable minds, and he returned with exactly the kind of operational knowledge and intellectual confidence that the ravaged Red Army desperately needed. He had not merely survived, he had grown, while others had simply ceased to exist. The officers who perished in those years were not weak men or dishonest ones. Many of them were precisely the sort of forward-thinking, analytically rigorous commanders who might have stood beside Zhukov or even above him in the years ahead. Their absence meant that the Red Army entered the most dangerous period in its history, under-led, under-theorized, and under-prepared, with a thinning layer of competent survivors scrambling to compensate for the gaps. Zhukov understood this in a way that went beyond simple awareness. He had seen what those gaps looked like from the outside, watching a Chinese military that struggled with exactly the same structural failures. He knew what a force looked like when its officers could not think faster than its enemies. He intended not to repeat that failure when his own moment came. The years in China also gave him something less tangible, but perhaps equally important: a certain hardening of perspective. He was watching a war that was not his own, in a country that was not his own, with resources he could not control and outcomes he could not determine. This is not a comfortable position for a man of Zhukov's temperament. He was not built for passivity, but the years of observation, of analysis without the authority to act on it directly, forged a quality in him that would prove essential in the catastrophic opening of the war to come. He learned to absorb chaos without being consumed by it. He learned to keep thinking when the situation was worst, to strip away the noise of immediate disaster and find the structural question underneath. This was not a skill taught in any academy. It was learned by watching things fall apart up close and asking, every time, not simply what went wrong, but why and what might have prevented it. When he finally returned to Soviet soil and resumed his place within the Red Army hierarchy, he came back into an institution that was simultaneously weaker and more desperate than the one he had left. Stalin needed commanders. The purge had left the Soviet military with hollow ranks at precisely the levels where complex thinking was most required. Zhukov, with his field experience, his foreign observations, his unbroken record of competence, and his survival of a period that had killed nearly everyone of comparable seniority, was suddenly one of the most valuable military assets the Soviet state possessed. He had not asked to be indispensable. Circumstance had arranged it. But he had also done the intellectual work, in China and before it, that made his indispensability something more than mere survival. He had a mind that the Red Army now needed more than it needed almost anything else. What Zhukov carried back from those years was not a single lesson but a constellation of them. Observations about armor and air power, about the relationship between initiative and logistics, about how an enemy's tempo could be read and then disrupted, about the difference between a military force that thinks at every level and one that waits for orders that are already too late. None of it was abstract to him. He had watched it operate in flesh and metal and burning ground. He had formed conclusions that no staff college briefing could have provided, and he had survived, intact, clear-eyed, and capable, while the men who might have competed with him for the opportunities ahead had been buried or broken by a system that consumed its own. He had been shaped by distance, he had been preserved by fortune, and he was returning to a country that, though it did not yet know it, was standing on the edge of the worst catastrophe in its long and brutalized history. The frontier between Mongolia and Manchuria was not a place men chose, it was a place they were sent, a vast, empty corridor of steppe grass and alkaline dust, where the wind moved without obstruction for hundreds of kilometers, and the summer sun turned the earth to something close to iron. There were no cities here, no strategic roads, no ports or railheads of obvious consequence. There was only the Khalkhin Gol River, a thin silver line threading through the grassland, and the question of which empire's flag would fly along its western bank. To the casual observer, it seemed like the sort of dispute that simmers at the edges of great powers without ever truly catching fire. But in the spring of 1939, as Europe held its breath and German divisions massed along Poland's borders, this remote Mongolian borderland was about to become the site of something the world had not yet seen, a fully realized, mechanized battle of annihilation, planned and executed by a Soviet general most of Moscow had barely noticed. Georgy Zhukov arrived at the Khalkhin Gol in late May of 1939 to find a situation that would have broken a less composed man. Soviet and Mongolian forces had already clashed with Japanese units from the Kwantung Army, one of the most aggressive and self-willed military organizations in the world, and the results had been poor. Soviet commanders on the ground were hesitant, supply lines were practically non-existent, and the nearest Soviet railhead sat nearly 600 kilometers to the west, across open steppe without a single improved road. The Japanese, by contrast, were confident. They had spent years fighting in Manchuria and northern China, developing a culture of offensive aggression that bordered on institutional contempt for defensive caution. Their doctrine held that spiritual resolve and infantry ferocity could overcome material disadvantage. It was a doctrine that had worked well enough against opponents who lacked the means to prove it wrong. Zhukov was about to become a very expensive education. What struck those around him first was not his confidence, though he had that in abundance. It was his absolute refusal to separate the question of fighting from the question of feeding and supplying the men who would do it. Before Zhukov would commit to any offensive plan, he needed the logistics solved, and in the summer of 1939, on the Mongolian steppe, that was an almost absurd requirement to meet. He demanded the construction of supply dumps, fuel depots, and ammunition stockpiles within range of the front. He demanded more than 500 truck runs per day along improvised tracks across the grassland. He calculated the fuel consumption of his armored formations down to the individual vehicle and built his operational timeline around what the supply chain could sustain. Other commanders of his era thought in terms of soldiers and guns. Zhukov thought in systems, and in 1939, that made him extraordinary. The Japanese struck first in early July, pushing across the Khalkhin-Gol River with infantry and armor in a series of aggressive lunges designed to establish a defensive line favorable to their territorial claims. The fighting was ferocious, and the gains were real. Soviet forces took serious casualties and gave ground along sections of the front. At his command post, Zhukov absorbed the reports without visible alarm. He had already decided that the Japanese attack was not the decisive event. His own offensive would be. Every Japanese soldier committed to an advance westward of the river was a soldier who would be harder to extract when the moment came. Zhukov was willing to absorb pressure along the front because he was building something they could not see. A force of more than 500 tanks, hundreds of armored cars, and massed artillery, assembled under strict radio silence and camouflage discipline across the open steppe to his rear. Deception was central to his plan in a way that reflected genuine military sophistication. Soviet engineers broadcast fake radio traffic to simulate continued defensive preparations. Trucks drove back and forth near Japanese observation posts, trailing dust to suggest ordinary logistical movement rather than offensive buildup. Aircraft flew deliberate patterns designed to normalize the sight of Soviet air activity without revealing its true scale. Meanwhile, the real preparations continued in silence. Zhukov divided his striking force into three groupings: a northern pincer, a southern pincer, and a central force designed to fix Japanese attention while the pincers closed. It was a classic encirclement concept, but the scale and coordination required to execute it on this terrain, with the communication technology of 1939, was something no Soviet commander had attempted before. On the 20th of August, 1939, Zhukov's artillery opened fire before dawn, with the full weight of every gun he had positioned over the preceding weeks. The Japanese had been given no warning, had received no intelligence suggesting what was about to hit them. More than 150 bombers struck their positions in the first hours, and then the tanks moved. The southern pincer drove hard and deep, bypassing Japanese strongpoints rather than reducing them, a doctrine Zhukov imposed against the instincts of subordinates trained to secure every position before advancing. Speed was the weapon, encirclement was the objective. Every hour the pincers moved faster than Japanese reserves could respond was an hour closer to the trap closing completely. Within 3 days, the geometry of the battle had shifted beyond Japanese ability to reverse. The two Soviet pincers met behind the main Japanese force, cutting off their route of retreat and severing their supply lines in a single, fluid movement. Inside the pocket, Japanese forces fought with the ferocity their doctrine demanded, counterattacking, refusing to surrender, absorbing casualties at a rate that would have caused most Western armies to collapse. It was not that the Kwantung Army lacked courage. It lacked the operational flexibility to adapt to a situation its commanders had genuinely not anticipated. They had prepared for an opponent who would fight the way they fought, aggressively forward, infantry-led, accepting close-quarters resolution. What they encountered instead was a Soviet force that moved faster, hit harder, and refused to be drawn into the kind of attritional close combat where Japanese tactical skill might compensate for their strategic encirclement. The battle was effectively decided within the first week. What followed was the systematic reduction of isolated Japanese positions, each of which had to be overcome individually by Soviet and Mongolian infantry, while the armored formations held the encirclement line against relief attempts from outside. Zhukov managed both tasks simultaneously, rotating units, adjusting his armor to meet each new probe from the Japanese relief forces, and maintaining pressure inside the pocket without allowing his lines to thin dangerously. The coordination required was immense. More than 50,000 Soviet soldiers engaged in concurrent operations across a front of considerable depth, and Zhukov directed it with a clarity of purpose that impressed even those who found his personal manner abrasive. By the end of August, organized Japanese resistance inside the pocket had been broken. The Kwantung Army's 6th Army had been shattered as a fighting force. Casualties on the Japanese side ran into the tens of thousands, with an enormous proportion killed rather than captured, a reflection of how the battle had been fought and of the Kwantung Army's own culture of resistance to surrender. Soviet losses were also heavy. This was not a bloodless campaign, but the strategic outcome was unambiguous. Japan's army, which had been pushing toward the Soviet Far East for years with barely concealed expansionist intent, had been stopped, bled, and humiliated by a military force they had underestimated. Tokyo's generals would spend years processing the implications. The geopolitical consequences of Khalkhin Gol stretched far beyond the Mongolian steppe. In conference rooms in Tokyo, the question of which direction Japan should expand, north into Siberia or south into the Pacific and Southeast Asia, was answered with brutal clarity by what had happened to the 6th Army. The Navy faction, which favored southern expansion toward oil and rubber, suddenly found its arguments far more persuasive. Japan would sign a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union less than 2 years later, and when Germany invaded Soviet territory in 1941, Japan would not follow. That decision, arguably one of the most consequential of the entire war, had its roots in the dust of the Mongolian steppe, in the summer that Zhukov showed Tokyo what Soviet armor could do. In Moscow, the reports arriving on Stalin's desk told their own story. Here was a Soviet general who had taken a logistical nightmare and a disadvantaged tactical situation and converted it into a model mechanized battle. Zhukov had coordinated armor, aircraft, artillery, and infantry in ways that Soviet doctrine described in theory, but had rarely achieved in practice. He had constructed an elaborate deception plan and executed it successfully against a capable enemy. He had maintained operational discipline under pressure and delivered a decisive result on a timetable. For a leader who had spent 2 years watching his officer corps collapse under purge and paranoia, this was not simply welcome news. It was a revelation. Stalin needed to understand who this man was. Zhukov, for his part, was about to find out what it meant to be noticed. What the battle at Khalkhin Gol ultimately revealed was not simply that Zhukov could fight. Other Soviet commanders could fight. What it revealed was that Zhukov could think, at scale, across time, and through the friction of an uncontrolled operational environment, in a way that his contemporaries simply could not match. He had not won by outnumbering the Japanese, though he did hold numerical advantages at the point of decision. He had won by designing a battle that played to his strengths and against his enemy's assumptions, then executing it with enough grip and discipline to prevent the inevitable confusion of combat from unraveling his plan. The farm boy from Strelkovka, the cavalryman who had survived revolution and purge, had become something the Soviet Union desperately needed and could barely admit it was capable of producing. A general of the First Order, in a time when generals of any order were growing scarce. He came back from Mongolia a different man. The steppe wind had scoured something permanent into him, a coldness behind the eyes, a patience that looked almost mechanical from the outside. Zhukov had gone east as a capable officer, one name among dozens competing for recognition inside a military machine that devoured its own. He returned as something the Red Army had not seen in years, a commander with an unambiguous, undeniable victory attached to his name. In the corridors of Moscow's military administration, where careers rose and fell on rumor and political proximity rather than battlefield performance, that distinction was rare enough to be almost disorienting. The war against Japan's Kwantung Army had not simply been won. It had been won cleanly, with coordination and finality. And in a system where Stalin measured everything, that kind of clarity was worth more than a shelf of written commendations. Zhukov was summoned westward, toward the center of Soviet power, toward a role that would test him in ways that no battlefield ever truly could. The appointment came in January of 1940, Chief of the General Staff. The words carried enormous formal weight inside the Soviet military structure. This was, in theory, the highest operational position in the entire Red Army, the officer responsible for planning, doctrine, readiness, and the coordination of forces numbering in the millions. On paper, the authority was sweeping. Zhukov was 43 years old, a product of cavalry service and self-education, with no formal General Staff Academy training behind him, only wars, and the specific, unforgiving intelligence that war produces in those who survive it long enough to learn. His predecessor in the post had been removed. His predecessor before that had been removed. The position had become something of a revolving door, not because the role was too demanding, but because Stalin himself had made it structurally impossible, demanding total loyalty, punishing independent thinking, and surrounding the army's leadership with political commissars whose job was to observe, report, and when necessary, destroy. Zhukov walked into that room with his eyes open. What he found when he looked beneath the official figures was deeply troubling. The Red Army of 1940 existed in a peculiar state of institutional contradiction. On the surface, its numbers were formidable. Millions of men under arms, vast stockpiles of armored vehicles and artillery, an industrial base that had been building capacity for more than a decade. Soviet tank production had outpaced every other nation in the world by a significant margin. The Air Force possessed thousands of aircraft. Divisions existed on paper from the Arctic to Central Asia, organized into a military architecture of enormous theoretical ambition. But the substance beneath those numbers had been hollowed out by something far more damaging than any foreign enemy. The Great Purge, Stalin's systematic elimination of perceived internal threats between 1936 and 1938, had consumed the officer corps with an appetite that left the army functionally leaderless at the precise moment when the world was sliding toward general war. The scale of that damage was almost impossible to fully process. 3 of the Red Army's 5 marshals had been executed. 13 of 15 army commanders were dead or imprisoned. 50 of 57 corps commanders had been removed from their posts, the majority of them shot. Roughly 35,000 officers across all ranks had been dismissed, imprisoned, or killed during those 2 years. Men who carried within them the institutional memory, the doctrinal understanding, and the command relationships that any functioning military depends on. What replaced them, in many cases, were officers promoted several grades above their experience, men who had learned to survive Soviet politics, but who had never managed forces at the scale their new ranks demanded. They were not cowards or incompetents necessarily. Some were gifted, but they had been handed responsibility without preparation. In a system where asking for guidance could be interpreted as weakness, and making an error could end in arrest. The psychological effect alone had frozen the army's capacity for honest internal assessment. Zhukov began working with the brutal urgency of a man who understood that time was not neutral. He had watched what German armor had done in Poland in 1939. He had watched it again in France in 1940, where Wehrmacht mechanized forces had crossed terrain that military tradition had considered impassable and collapsed the French military in roughly 6 weeks. An outcome that stunned the world and should have electrified every senior officer in every army that expected to face Germany. Zhukov was electrified. He had already proven at Khalkhin Gol that combined arms operations, armor, artillery, air cover, and infantry moving together under a unified command concept, were the decisive mechanism of modern warfare. He now needed to translate that understanding into the structure of an army that still, in many of its formations, thought in categories inherited from the previous war. The problems compounded each other in ways that resisted simple solution. Doctrine was one challenge. The Red Army had actually developed sophisticated mechanized warfare theory during the early 1930s. Deep battle theory, the concept of striking simultaneously across the entire depth of the enemy's formation. But the purge had killed or imprisoned many of the theorists who built it, and Stalin's own preferences had pushed the army toward more conservative, politically manageable concepts. Radio communications were inadequate across most formations. Logistics, the unglamorous, absolutely essential science of feeding, supplying, and moving armies, was poorly organized and chronically underfunded relative to the combat arms that received all the political attention. Officers who flagged these problems in writing were taking a personal risk. The system had trained people to present optimistic reports upward, because pessimistic ones attracted scrutiny, and scrutiny attracted the security services, and the security services were not interested in distinguishing between honest assessment and defeatism. Zhukov navigated this with a particular kind of intelligence. Not the intelligence of the theorist or the diplomat, but the intelligence of the man who has learned to read rooms and systems, to understand where real authority sits versus ceremonial authority, to identify what can be changed and what must be worked around. He pushed for the restoration of large mechanized corps, the armored formations that had been broken up after critics, some of them now dead or imprisoned, had argued they were unmanageable. He pressed for more realistic training, for exercises that reflected actual battlefield conditions rather than scripted performances designed to please senior observers. He worked to move officers into positions that matched their competence rather than their political connections, where Stalin's patience for that kind of reshuffling allowed it. Every reform had to be framed carefully, presented as loyalty to the Soviet vision rather than criticism of the system that Zhukov himself was now a senior representative of. Stalin was never absent from any of this. The relationship between Zhukov and the man in the Kremlin was one of the war's defining dynamics, a kind of terrible symbiosis between a political autocrat who needed military genius he could neither fully trust nor safely discard, and a general who needed the resources and authority that only the autocrat could grant. Zhukov would later describe the experience of briefing Stalin as requiring the same kind of psychological preparation as combat. You chose your words, you watched the eyes, you learned which truths could be delivered directly and which required wrapping in language that preserved Stalin's sense of control over the conclusion. Getting something wrong in that room, making an argument too bluntly, contradicting Stalin in a way that read as challenge rather than counsel, could end a career before midnight. Zhukov developed the skill, though it never fully insulated him from Stalin's moods or suspicions. There were moments where that relationship crackled with genuine danger. Zhukov's intelligence assessments increasingly pointed toward German intentions on the Soviet border. The buildup of forces in occupied Poland and Romania was not subtle to anyone willing to look at it honestly. He pressed for defensive preparations, for alerting frontline commanders, for drawing down the margin of complacency that peace, even tense peace, produces in any military structure. Stalin resisted, not from ignorance, but from a calculated political judgment that preparing too visibly for war would provoke the war he still believed he could defer. The tension between military logic and political calculation ran through everything Zhukov attempted during those months, and it taught him a lesson that would define his approach for the remainder of the conflict. That in the Soviet system, military genius was only ever as effective as the political permission surrounding it. The Winter War against Finland, fought between 1939 and 1940, had already delivered a humiliating reminder of how far Soviet military capacity had degraded. A nation of roughly 3.5 million people had held off the Red Army for months, inflicting casualties that shocked Western observers and reinforced German military confidence in Soviet weakness. The lessons were registered, and Zhukov absorbed them with the attention of someone who understood what they implied about the army he had just inherited responsibility for. Finland was not Germany. If the Red Army had struggled to organize and execute even that operation at acceptable cost, the implications for what a war against Wehrmacht armored forces would produce were sobering in the extreme. He worked. That is the simplest description of what Zhukov did during his tenure as Chief of the General Staff. He worked with an intensity that consumed the people around him and that drew both admiration and resentment in equal measure. He was not a warm man in leadership. He did not comfort or reassure. He demanded, he corrected, he moved fast, and expected the people beneath him to move at the same pace. Officers who met his standard found in him a fierce advocate. Those who failed it found the consequences immediate and unsentimental. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else inside the Soviet military at that moment, that the army being built during 1940 and into 1941 was building towards something specific, and that the margin for error when that something arrived would be almost non-existent. The army he was building was not yet ready when the blow came. No amount of organizational energy could fully undo in months what the purge had destroyed over years. But the work mattered. The doctrinal restoration mattered. The mechanized corps mattered. The officers quietly moved into better matched positions mattered. When Operation Barbarossa shattered the frontier in the early morning hours of late June 1941 and threw the entire Soviet military structure into crisis, it was not from a standing start that the Red Army would begin its long, agonizing recovery. It was from a foundation that Zhukov, imperfect, constrained, operating within a system that fought him at every turn, had spent 18 months trying to pour. Before the first shot was fired, the signs were there. German reconnaissance aircraft had been crossing Soviet airspace for months. Defectors had crossed the frontier with warnings. Intelligence reports had accumulated on desks in Moscow, each one describing the same unmistakable pattern. A massive military build-up along the western border, armored divisions repositioning, supply depots filling, engineers preparing bridging equipment for river crossings that no defensive operation would ever need. Zhukov had read these reports. He had argued for a defensive alert, and he had been overruled, not by evidence, but by a man who believed that Adolf Hitler would not attack the Soviet Union until Britain was defeated, and who treated any suggestion to the contrary as either incompetence or deliberate provocation. Stalin's conviction was not strategy, It was wishful thinking dressed in the language of geopolitics. And in the early hours of the 22nd of June 1941, the full weight of its consequences fell upon 4.5 million Soviet soldiers who had not been permitted to prepare for what was coming. The attack began before sunrise. More than 3 million German and Axis troops surged across a frontier stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the largest land invasion in the history of warfare. 3 massive army groups, North, Centre, and South, drove eastward along axes that had been planned, rehearsed, and refined for more than a year. Within minutes, Soviet airfields were being struck by Luftwaffe bombers that had crossed the border at low altitude, destroying hundreds of aircraft before their pilots could reach them. Artillery barrages shattered border positions where Soviet soldiers were still sleeping. Armored columns punched through gaps in Soviet defensive lines before regimental commanders had even been informed that war had begun. The first hours of Barbarossa were not a battle, they were a catastrophe, swift and almost total in their violence, falling on an army that had been ordered to stand down its guard. Zhukov received the first reports in Moscow around 0330 hours. The calls coming in from the border districts were fragmented, contradictory, and increasingly desperate. Some commanders reporting massive attacks along their entire front, others unable to raise their forward positions at all. He went immediately to Stalin's dacha, where he found the Soviet leader not roused to decisive action, but visibly stunned into a silence that those present would later describe as something close to paralysis. The man who had spent years eliminating anyone who might challenge his authority now found himself confronting a challenge that no purge could answer. Zhukov pressed for immediate authorization to respond, to order counterattacks, to mobilize reserves. What he received instead was hesitation, and then denial, and then a series of directives so cautious and politically hedged that they were almost meaningless as military orders. It was the worst possible beginning to the worst possible war, and Zhukov knew it in the first hour. The orders that went out to Soviet frontier forces in those first hours told commanders to repel the attack, but not to cross into German territory, as though the distinction between offense and defense still carried any practical meaning against armored formations moving at 30 to 40 kilometers per hour. Soviet mechanized corps, which on paper represented enormous armored power, were sent forward in uncoordinated counterattacks, without adequate fuel, without air cover, and without reliable communications. They ran directly into German anti-tank screens and Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft, and were torn apart in engagements that lasted hours rather than days. The losses of vehicles and men in these early counterattacks were staggering, not because Soviet soldiers lacked courage, but because they were being sent to fight in conditions their commanders had not been allowed to prepare for. Equipment that had never been properly maintained broke down on the approach march. Radio operators who had never been trained on their sets could not coordinate fires. The chaos was not accidental. It was the accumulated consequence of years of purge-induced incompetence and political interference dressed up as military command. Within the first week, the scale of disaster became impossible to conceal even from Stalin. German Army Group Center had advanced more than 300 kilometers. Entire Soviet armies were being encircled, cut off from supply, from reinforcement, from command, as German armored pincers closed behind them with horrifying speed. The encirclement at Bialystok and Minsk trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, men who fought on for days and in some cases weeks before their ammunition ran out and their position became untenable. For Zhukov, receiving these reports at the General Staff in Moscow, Every figure was a verdict on the state of the army he had inherited as Chief of Staff only months before. He had known it was unprepared. He had not known how completely unprepared it was until German armor demonstrated the answer in blood and territory. Stalin sent Zhukov to the southwestern front in the first days of the crisis, the first of many emergency deployments to threatened sectors that would define his role throughout the summer and autumn. Traveling to the front was to enter a different world from the one represented on maps in Moscow. Roads clogged with retreating units, civilian refugees, burning vehicles. Headquarters that had lost contact with their subordinate formations. Officers who had received no orders for days and were improvising survival rather than executing strategy. Zhukov moved through this disorder with the focused intensity that would become his most recognized professional quality, asking precise questions, demanding specific answers, cutting through the confusion to identify what could actually be salvaged and what was already lost. He had no patience for excuses, no tolerance for commanders who described their situation without proposing a response to it. In the chaos of the frontier battles, this quality was not admired by everyone, but it was desperately needed. The Southwestern Front presented Zhukov with a situation that was simultaneously catastrophic and, in one narrow sense, instructive. Soviet mechanized forces in Ukraine were attempting something like the coordinated armored counterattack that doctrine called for, and for a brief period in late June, they struck German armored formations hard enough to give the enemy serious concern. The fighting around the frontier region of Brody involved some of the largest concentrations of armor seen in the war to that point. Soviet tank brigades pressing against German panzer divisions in engagements that, had they been better supplied and coordinated, might have achieved genuine disruption. They did not achieve it. Fuel ran out. Air support never materialized. Communications collapsed at critical moments. The mechanized corps were ground down and eventually broken, but not before Zhukov observed something important: that Soviet armor, properly concentrated and directed, could make German armor bleed. That knowledge would take time to apply. The time it would cost was measured in lives beyond counting. Through July and August, the disasters continued at a scale that strained comprehension. German encirclements at Uman and then at Kiev swallowed entire Soviet army groups, each one representing hundreds of thousands of men who entered captivity or death in the space of days. The Kiev encirclement was perhaps the most painful for Zhukov personally. He had argued, in one of the most consequential staff discussions of the war, that Kiev should be abandoned before German forces could close the pocket, that the army defending the city should withdraw eastward to preserve its fighting strength. Stalin rejected the argument with fury, and Zhukov was removed temporarily from his position as Chief of Staff as a consequence of the disagreement. He was assigned to command the reserve front instead, a demotion that was simultaneously a punishment and, in terms of keeping him in the war, perhaps the decision that saved his career and ultimately his life. Kiev fell. More than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were lost in the encirclement. The general who had warned against it was now being given an opportunity to prove himself at the front rather than behind a desk. His command of the reserve front produced one of the few genuine Soviet tactical successes of the entire summer. At Yelnya, Zhukov organized a counter-offensive that recaptured a German-held salient, a small operation by the standards of what would come later, but significant for what it demonstrated. Soviet forces, given clear objectives, adequate reserves, and a commander who understood the relationship between artillery preparation and infantry advance, could take ground from the Wehrmacht and hold it. The Yelnya operation was not decisive in strategic terms, but it was proof of something the Red Army desperately needed to demonstrate to itself, that the German advance was not inevitable, that there existed a method of fighting that could produce a different result than the encirclements and routs of the summer. Zhukov absorbed every lesson the operation offered with characteristic intensity, filing them against the day when the scale of resources available to him would match the scale of his ambition. By September and October, German forces were pushing toward Moscow itself in Operation Typhoon, and the capital city entered a state of emergency that saw the government partially evacuated eastward. Zhukov was recalled to command the Western Front, responsible for the direct defense of Moscow, arriving to find a situation that by any rational assessment should have been hopeless. German armored spearheads had torn open Soviet defensive lines in multiple places simultaneously. Divisions on paper existed as fragments in reality. The roads to Moscow were open in ways that German intelligence maps had begun to reflect with dangerous accuracy. Zhukov received his command not with a plan, but with a crisis, and responded in the way he always responded, by identifying the most dangerous gaps, committing whatever reserves existed to seal them, and demanding from every unit around him a degree of resistance that the situation did not appear to permit. What Zhukov understood by the autumn of 1941, after months of managing catastrophes that no training had prepared him for, was something that could not be reduced to doctrine or formula. The Wehrmacht was not invincible. It was formidable, superbly trained, and led by officers of genuine competence, but it was finite. It had boundaries of logistics and manpower and endurance that Soviet depth and mass could, in the long run, exploit. German speed was a weapon that depended on Soviet disorganization to function. Every time Soviet forces managed to slow the enemy advance, to make armor fight for ground rather than sweep through it, the calculation shifted slightly. The summer had been a disaster that cost the Soviet Union an almost incomprehensible quantity of human life, and Zhukov carried the knowledge of that cost with him in a way that would shape every decision he made thereafter. He was not unchanged by what he had witnessed. No one who had seen what he saw in those months could be, but where a lesser commander might have been broken by it, Zhukov was being forged, ground into a harder and more precise instrument by the very catastrophe he was fighting to survive. The summer of 1941 unfolds as a nightmare, rendered in slow motion across the vast expanse of Soviet territory. Barbarossa has been launched for mere weeks, yet the scale of catastrophe already exceeds anything the Red Army's leadership had imagined possible. Columns of German mechanized forces advance at speeds that seem to mock the traditional rules of warfare. Soviet armies, caught in static defensive positions and burdened by outdated doctrines, collapse in sequence, like dominoes struck by an invisible hand. In the opening days and weeks following that 22nd of June, the Wehrmacht executes a series of colossal encirclements at Minsk, at Smolensk, at Kiev, that trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in pockets from which there is often no escape. The scale of these losses is almost incomprehensible to anyone versed in the rational calculations of military science. Nearly 3 million Soviet soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured in the first 6 months of the war. This figure represents not merely a military defeat, but a hemorrhaging of national manpower that threatens to drain the Soviet state dry. Yet in the midst of this torrent of disaster, Georgy Zhukov emerges not as a general paralyzed by crisis, but as something far more valuable to Stalin, a military mind that refuses to surrender to despair, even when despair seems to be the only rational response. He travels ceaselessly between fronts, appearing at command posts often before the commanders stationed there fully comprehend the magnitude of their predicament. He witnesses chaos that would break lesser men, armies dissolving into confusion, entire divisions trapped in forests without ammunition or leadership, soldiers wandering in circles through territory they cannot hold. Yet Zhukov does not waste time on recrimination or self-pity. Instead, he focuses on the brutal mathematics of survival. He understands that the Soviet Union cannot win through defensive stalemate. Germany has committed resources and preparation far beyond what the Soviets had anticipated. The German army has achieved a level of mechanized coordination and tactical mobility that the Soviet forces, despite possessing superior numbers on paper, cannot immediately match. The solution, therefore, cannot involve standing firm and repelling the invader through sheer defensive strength. Rather, Zhukov begins to construct a different kind of strategy, one that embraces retreat as a calculated choice rather than a shameful defeat. This philosophy runs counter to everything Stalin has demanded from his commanders throughout the early weeks of the war. Stalin's orders, delivered with fury and paranoia, insist that Soviet forces hold their ground at any cost, that surrender of territory is treason, that any general who permits a German advance should face execution. Yet Zhukov, because of his competence and his singular relationship with Stalin, possesses a narrow space in which to operate. He speaks to the dictator with a directness that no other commander dares attempt. When Stalin demands the impossible, Zhukov does not promise victory he cannot deliver. Instead, he explains, with cold clarity, exactly what the situation demands. He presents facts without embellishment, numbers without exaggeration. This honesty, in a system built on lies and propaganda, becomes unexpectedly precious to Stalin. The dictator, despite his paranoia and his hunger for flattery, comes to trust Zhukov precisely because the general refuses to flatter him. Zhukov tells Stalin what he needs to know, not what he wishes to hear. This relationship, fragile though it is, and dependent entirely on continued success, allows Zhukov to pursue a military strategy that would see any other commander shot for defeatism. The core of Zhukov's approach involves trading space for time. The Soviet Union possesses space in abundance, vast territories stretching thousands of kilometers toward the east, and time is the one resource that can be purchased with territory. As German forces advance deeper into Soviet lands, their supply lines stretch across longer and longer distances. Their momentum, however overwhelming in the opening weeks, is governed by the physics of logistics. A panzer division must be fed, its vehicles must be refueled, ammunition must be transported across hundreds of kilometers of captured road and rail. Meanwhile, the Red Army, falling back toward its own heartland, shortens its supply lines with every kilometer of retreat. Zhukov recognizes this dynamic and weaponizes it. He orders strategic withdrawals that minimize encirclement and preserve fighting strength. He pulls armies back from impossible positions before they can be completely surrounded. He surrenders city after city, Minsk, Smolensk, Novgorod, each retreat a calculated decision rather than a panicked flight. To Stalin, who has ordered that Soviet forces hold these cities to the last man, these decisions appear to border on treason. Yet they are the only decisions that prevent the complete annihilation of Soviet military power in the opening weeks of the war. Through the autumn of 1941, Zhukov begins to introduce another dimension to Soviet strategy, the counterattack. Even as German armies push toward Moscow and the situation appears to be approaching its most desperate phase, Zhukov identifies weaknesses in the German advance that can be exploited. The Wehrmacht, for all its tactical sophistication, has committed enormous resources to the central drive toward the Soviet capital. Its flanks, particularly in the south near Kharkov and in other sectors along the vast front, are sometimes thinly held. Zhukov begins to orchestrate counterattacks, not massive offensives designed to reclaim lost territory, but smaller, focused strikes that disrupt German momentum and inflict losses that Germany cannot easily replace. These counterattacks rarely achieve their maximum theoretical objectives. The Soviet forces executing them are often hastily assembled, poorly coordinated, and lacking in mechanized assets. Yet they achieve something psychologically precious. They restore the idea that the Soviet military is capable of striking back, that the Wehrmacht is not invincible, that the outcome of the war has not been predetermined by the opening German victories. The human cost of these operations defies comprehension. Soviet soldiers, many of them poorly trained and equipped with outdated weapons, are thrown against German defensive positions with the expectation that they will break through or die trying. Casualty rates exceed anything recorded in modern warfare before this conflict. Villages that have been liberated are often retaken by German counterattacks. Territory is won and lost in a grinding cycle of attack and retreat. Zhukov, observing these operations, understands the terrible mathematics of what is occurring. Every soldier who dies in these counterattacks, though he dies for a Soviet victory that remains distant and uncertain, is buying the Red Army time to reorganize. Every day that German momentum is slowed is a day that Soviet factories further east can manufacture more weapons, train more soldiers, and prepare deeper defensive positions. Zhukov never allows sentiment to cloud this calculation. He is not a sentimental man, and the scale of the war does not permit sentimentality. The Soviet Union is fighting not merely for territory or ideology, but for its very survival. Zhukov has internalized this existential truth and acts accordingly. By the autumn of 1941, Zhukov's authority within the Soviet military establishment has expanded considerably. He remains chief of the General Staff, but he has become something more: the principal architect of Soviet military strategy, the general whose approval is required before major operations can be launched. Other commanders, Alexander Vasilevsky, Ivan Konev, and others, who will later become legendary figures in their own right, operate within frameworks that Zhukov has established. He coordinates between fronts, ensuring that operations occurring in the south do not conflict with those in the center or north. He identifies emerging threats before they reach their maximum severity. When German formations attempt to encircle Soviet armies in one sector, Zhukov often has already begun moving reserves to thicken the defense in adjacent sectors. This coordination across fronts separated by hundreds of kilometers, executed through radio communications and couriers traveling across battlefields, represents a feat of command and control that exceeds anything the Wehrmacht has attempted. The German army is tactically superior in many respects, but Zhukov's mastery of the operational level, the coordination of multiple armies and fronts, begins to emerge as a distinct advantage that grows more pronounced as the war continues. Yet Zhukov remains acutely aware that his position, however elevated and however necessary to Soviet victory, is ultimately dependent on Stalin's continued approval. The dictator's paranoia does not diminish with Zhukov's success. In fact, success can be as dangerous as failure in a totalitarian system where power is zero-sum and potential rivals are regarded as threats. Zhukov has witnessed the fates of countless other officers and military officials who have fallen from favor. He understands that a single miscalculation, a single operation that fails to achieve Stalin's expectations, could result in his removal or worse. This awareness informs every decision he makes and every recommendation he offers to the Soviet leadership. He must balance the demands of sound military strategy against the demands of remaining in Stalin's favor. He must pursue operations that have genuine military merit, while simultaneously ensuring that they align with Stalin's political objectives and his appetite for action. This constant negotiation between military rationality and political necessity occupies much of Zhukov's mental energy during these terrible months of 1941. The Soviet general's reputation at this time remains mixed. Among the officer corps, Zhukov is respected for his competence and feared for his ruthlessness in demanding that orders be executed exactly as given. He shows little patience for commanders who offer excuses or attempt to explain why operations have failed. He expects results, and he is willing to relieve commanders who do not deliver them, regardless of their rank or connections. Yet this very ruthlessness also endears him to the upper levels of the Soviet military hierarchy. In a system where excuses can be fatal, commanders come to prefer a superior who is clear in his expectations and merciless in enforcing them. Zhukov's willingness to demand excellence and to hold subordinates accountable becomes a model that other senior commanders begin to emulate. Moreover, Zhukov's evident determination to continue fighting, his refusal to acknowledge the possibility of Soviet defeat, communicates itself through the chain of command. The despair that grips many Soviet officers in the opening months of the war does not visibly affect Zhukov. He acts as though Soviet victory, though it may be years away and will require enormous sacrifice, is inevitable. This psychological projection of confidence, however fragile its actual foundation, influences the atmosphere of command at the highest levels. The lessons Zhukov absorbs during the remainder of 1941 shape everything he will accomplish in subsequent years. He learns that German tactical superiority can be countered through superior coordination and operational vision. He learns that the Wehrmacht, for all its mechanized prowess, operates within constraints imposed by logistics and geography. He learns that the Soviet system, despite its inefficiencies and its brutality, can harness enormous resources toward military production once the political will is applied. He observes how German tactics, effective in the opening months when Soviet forces are disorganized and ill-prepared, become less effective as the Red Army adapts and as Soviet commanders gain experience. He watches how German generals, operating in a system that sometimes punishes them for caution, continue to pursue objectives even when the tactical situation does not favor them. These observations do not lead Zhukov to underestimate German military capability, but they do convince him that the outcome of the war is not predetermined by German superiority. The outcome will be determined, instead, by strategic choices, by the ability to coordinate massive resources over extended periods, by the willingness to absorb terrible losses without losing the capacity to continue fighting. These are areas where Zhukov believes the Soviet system, for all its flaws, possesses advantages. As 1941 draws to a close and German armies settle into winter positions outside Moscow, the situation remains desperate, but no longer appears to be immediately catastrophic. Moscow has been defended. Leningrad, though surrounded and starving, has not fallen. The Red Army, though battered and depleted, remains in the field and continues to offer organized resistance. This is no small achievement, given what has occurred in the preceding months. Zhukov deserves significant credit for these outcomes, though the full extent of his contribution remains clouded by the propaganda of the Soviet state and by the very real dangers of appearing to monopolize credit for Soviet successes. Other commanders and commissars have also made contributions. The Soviet soldiers themselves, enduring conditions of almost unimaginable hardship and deprivation, have demonstrated a resilience that has surprised even the Soviet leadership. Yet Zhukov's role in preserving Soviet military capability and in establishing the strategic frameworks that will carry the Red Army toward eventual victory cannot be overstated. He has established himself not merely as a competent commander, but as the military conscience of the Soviet system, the one general who can speak truth to Stalin, who understands the scale of the challenge ahead, and who possesses both the will and the capability to orchestrate the Soviet response. This position, achieved through a combination of skill, ruthlessness, and fortune, will place him at the center of the Soviet war effort for the remainder of the conflict, and will ultimately determine the course of the greatest war in human history. The summer of 1942 brought a transformation in the nature of the war on the Eastern Front. Where the Germans had once dictated tempo and tactics, they now found themselves drawn into a grinding campaign of attrition that would test not just military capability, but the very will of nations to endure. The Wehrmacht, despite its apparent strength, was stretching across an ever-widening expanse of Russian territory, its supply lines growing thinner with each advancing kilometer, its soldiers growing weary beneath an unforgiving sky. Stalin, sensing both vulnerability and opportunity, demanded that his armies seize the initiative, and it was Zhukov who stood beside him, calculating the precise moment when the Soviet Union could deliver its hammer blow. The target would be Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city on the western bank of the Volga River, and the operation would bear a name that echoed Russia's greatest general, Uranus. For months, the Wehrmacht had been advancing southeastward from the Don River toward the Caucasus, hoping to seize the oil fields that would fuel Germany's war machine. Stalingrad stood directly in their path, a city of perhaps 600,000 souls before the invasion, reduced now to a nightmare world of rubble and desperate resistance. The Germans, under the command of Friedrich Paulus and the Sixth Army, entered the city in late August and became immediately ensnared in urban combat unlike anything they had encountered before. Street by street, block by block, the fighting intensified into a fever of close-quarters violence and attrition. Soviet defenders, directed by General Alexander Rodimtsev and his fellow commanders, fought with a ferocity born from desperation and political necessity, for Stalin had issued Order Number 227 in late July, declaring that retreat was no longer permitted, that soldiers would stand or die where they stood. The city became a furnace where both sides were consumed in equal measure, yet the Germans found themselves unable to deliver the knockout blow. While the fighting raged in the streets and ruins of Stalingrad itself, Zhukov and his strategic partner, Alexander Vasilevsky, were orchestrating something far larger behind the scenes. These two men, rising stars in Soviet military hierarchy, understood that the German advance had created a vulnerability that could be exploited with catastrophic effect. The Germans were concentrated heavily at Stalingrad, pulling in reserves and throwing them into the grinding street combat, while their flanks, particularly to the north and south of the city, were held by less capable Allied forces, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units that lacked both the equipment and the morale to withstand a determined Soviet assault. Zhukov and Vasilevsky, working through autumn 1942, conceived a plan of audacious simplicity. Rather than engage the Germans in the city itself, they would punch through the weaker flanks, encircle the entire German force, and trap it in the ruins. The operation would be called Uranus, named after the Greek god of chaos and the sky, a name that seemed to promise both confusion and overwhelming force. The preparation for Operation Uranus was itself a masterpiece of military logistics and deception. Zhukov moved more than 1 million soldiers into position along fronts north and south of Stalingrad, assembling them in secret, concealing their presence from German reconnaissance through careful camouflage, discipline, and misinformation. Tanks, artillery, and supply convoys moved only at night or beneath canvas, and German intelligence, already stretched thin and dependent on aerial reconnaissance, failed to detect the true scale of Soviet preparations. Zhukov coordinated not just armies but entire fronts, synchronizing movements across distances of hundreds of kilometers to ensure that when the assault began, the Germans would face simultaneous hammer blows from multiple directions from which they could not escape. The plan required a level of coordination that the Soviet military, still recovering from the purges and still learning the mechanics of large-scale modern warfare, had never before attempted. Zhukov's confidence in his ability to pull off such a complex operation was itself an indicator of how far the Red Army had come in 2 years of brutal education. On the 19th of November 1942, at 0005 hours in the morning darkness, Soviet artillery opened fire along the northern flank near a place called Serafimovich. The bombardment was preceded by a rolling barrage that tore through the frozen steppes, and then the Soviet spearheads, cavalry and mechanized forces, surged forward against the unprepared Romanian forces. The Romanians, lacking armor in sufficient quantities and lacking the training to resist such an assault, collapsed within hours. To the south, on the 21st of November, another Soviet force attacked across the Kalmyk steppe, again encountering Romanian defenders who could offer only token resistance before falling back or surrendering in large numbers. The Soviet forces, moving at a pace that astonished even German observers accustomed to rapid armored operations, drove westward and northward in vast pincer movements designed to meet and encircle the German Sixth Army concentrated in and around Stalingrad. The Germans, realizing the catastrophe unfolding around them, appealed to Hitler for permission to withdraw, but Hitler, committed to the idea that Stalingrad must be held, refused. By the 23rd of November, the Soviet forces had closed their encirclement. More than 300,000 German soldiers, along with substantial Romanian and Italian contingents, found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket of territory centered on Stalingrad and the surrounding steppes. The winter was closing in with brutal intensity, temperatures dropping toward 40 degrees below 0 Celsius, and the trapped forces faced not just Soviet assault, but the grinding attrition of hunger, cold, and despair. Zhukov, now wielding authority that placed him second only to Stalin himself, directed the compression of the pocket day by day, week by week. The Germans attempted to break out, but Soviet defenses, reinforced continually and directed with precision by Zhukov's staff, held firm. German attempts to supply the trapped forces by air failed due to Soviet air superiority and the sheer magnitude of the supply needed. The Luftwaffe proved incapable of delivering sufficient food, ammunition, and fuel to sustain more than 300,000 soldiers in the midst of winter. The moral and psychological weight of the encirclement grew as the months wore on. General Paulus, the commander of the trapped Sixth Army, transmitted increasingly desperate messages to German high command, requesting either relief, supply, or permission to surrender. Each request was denied. Hitler, viewing the battle as a test of will and a symbol of German racial superiority, declared that Stalingrad must be held and that relief would come. Relief never came. Instead, a German relief force under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm in early December, an attempt to break through the Soviet encirclement from the west. But Zhukov had anticipated this possibility and positioned reserves accordingly. The German relief column never penetrated more than about 40 kilometers before being contained and eventually pushed back, and the trapped forces in Stalingrad remained isolated. The psychological impact of this failure was profound, signaling to observers across the world that Germany was no longer invincible, that Soviet forces could not only resist, but could decisively defeat the Wehrmacht in large-scale operations. As November gave way to December, and December turned into the new year of 1943, conditions within the German pocket deteriorated beyond description. Frostbite and malnutrition claimed soldiers nearly as efficiently as Soviet bullets and artillery. German physicians performed amputations with minimal anesthetics, and soldiers froze to death in their positions despite orders to stand firm. The Soviet forces, coordinating their efforts through Zhukov's meticulous direction, gradually squeezed the pocket, reducing it from a vast area of the steppes to an increasingly compressed zone centered on the city ruins themselves. Surrender negotiations occurred in early February, with Zhukov and his subordinates eventually accepting the capitulation of German forces. Paulus, having fought until his position became untenable, surrendered himself, becoming the first German field marshal to be captured by Soviet forces. The psychological impact of his capture reverberated through Germany, signaling to the German people that their nation's military machine, for all its reputation and prestige, was not omnipotent. The casualties at Stalingrad remain among the most staggering figures in military history. The Soviet forces suffered roughly 200,000 killed and missing, with additional hundreds of thousands wounded, making the city one of the costliest victories ever purchased. The Germans and their allies lost approximately 250,000 soldiers to death, wounds, or capture, a devastating hemorrhage from their total military strength. Yet despite the horrifying arithmetic of human cost, the strategic and psychological consequences were decisive and irreversible. After Stalingrad, the Soviet Union never again questioned whether it could defeat Germany. The only question was how long the process would take and how many more soldiers would die in the final victory. The German military, conversely, understood that they faced an enemy capable not just of defense, but of mounting large-scale coordinated offensives across vast fronts. The myth of German invincibility, which had sustained the Nazi regime and terrorized Europe for 3 years, was shattered on the frozen steppes and in the ruins of Stalingrad. Zhukov's role in orchestrating this victory elevated him to a position of unprecedented authority within Soviet military circles. He was not merely a general executing Stalin's orders. He had become the strategic architect of Soviet victory, the man who understood both the capabilities and limitations of the Red Army, and who could translate Stalin's ambitions into operational reality. His partnership with Vasilevsky, though often overlooked in historical accounts, was essential to the execution of Operation Uranus. Between them, they represented a new generation of Soviet military leadership, men who had survived the purges not through political maneuvering, but through competence, who understood modern mechanized warfare from experience rather than theory, and who could operate effectively within the brutal constraints of Stalin's autocratic system. The victory at Stalingrad established Zhukov as the indispensable man, the commander upon whom Stalin would rely for every subsequent major operation, the Soviet general whose name would become synonymous with final victory. The consequences of Stalingrad rippled far beyond the frozen steppes of southern Russia. In Germany, the defeat triggered a profound loss of confidence in Hitler's strategic judgment, though open criticism remained dangerous and was suppressed. In the wider world, Nations that had viewed Soviet Russia as weak and vulnerable suddenly had to recalculate their strategic assumptions. In Japan, the intelligence about this Soviet victory contributed to the decision to focus expansion southward toward the Pacific rather than northward against the Soviet Union, a calculation that would spare the Red Army from fighting a two-front war. For Zhukov personally, Stalingrad marked the moment when he transitioned from capable general managing disaster to master strategist wielding enormous power. The grinding attrition of the First World War, the lessons learned in Manchuria, the survival of the purges, and the education in mechanized warfare from 1941 onward, all culminated in this operation. He had taken the raw material of Soviet military power, the courage and resilience of Russian soldiers, and the vast resources of the Soviet state, and he had forged them into an instrument capable of defeating the most formidable military machine Europe had ever produced. The winter of 1942 to 1943 saw the old order on the Eastern Front crumble, and a new reality establish itself. The Germans would continue to fight with skill and determination, would win local victories and inflict tremendous casualties, but they would never again hold the strategic initiative. That initiative had passed to Zhukov and the Soviet command, and they would wield it with increasing confidence and precision. Stalingrad was not the end of the war on the Eastern Front. Nearly 2.5 more years of fighting remained, but it was the moment when the outcome ceased to be in doubt. From this point forward, every German operation would be a delaying action, every Soviet offensive another step toward final victory. The city on the Volga had become the turning point, the battle that transformed a desperate struggle for survival into a confident march toward triumph. Zhukov, standing in the snow and the darkness of that Russian winter, surveyed the ruins he had created and the hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers he had trapped, understanding perhaps that he was witnessing the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany and the emergence of the Soviet Union as a world power of unquestionable military strength. The grinding battle for Stalingrad had reached its crescendo by late autumn of 1942. The city, now reduced to rubble and ash, sprawled along the Volga River like the skeleton of something that had once lived. For months, German and Soviet forces had clawed at each other street by street, building by building, in combat so intimate and desperate that it transcended military convention. The Wehrmacht had achieved penetration into the heart of the city, yet could not quite finish what it had begun. Zhukov watched from his command post, absorbing intelligence reports and casualty figures that would have broken lesser men. He understood something that many German commanders did not. The Wehrmacht was overextended, its flanks dangerously thin, its supply lines stretched across vast steppes toward distant railheads. The Soviet armies had absorbed punishment that should have annihilated them, yet they remained, battered but intact, waiting for the moment when they could strike back. The plan that Zhukov conceived with his key collaborator, General Alexander Vasilevsky, was audacious in its simplicity and staggering in its scope. Rather than continue the grinding attrition within Stalingrad itself, they would ignore the city entirely and strike at the German flanks, not with precision, but with overwhelming force. To the north and south of Stalingrad, German positions were held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian Allied divisions, competent soldiers in many respects, but lacking the equipment, experience, and cohesion of German units. These formations represented the Wehrmacht's greatest vulnerability. Zhukov and Vasilevsky assembled nearly 1 million Soviet soldiers across multiple fronts, concentrating armor and artillery in quantities the Germans had never encountered in any single operation. The plan bore a name, Operation Uranus. It was scheduled to begin in mid-November, when the autumn rains had frozen into ground hard enough to support heavy vehicles. Secrecy was maintained with a discipline that would have impressed any intelligence officer. German reconnaissance flights were hunted down or turned away. Radio discipline prevented the transmission of detailed orders. The accumulation of supplies and ammunition occurred at night or under camouflage. When the Red Army struck, it would do so as a surprise that could not be easily countered. On the 19th of November 1942, the Soviet offensive opened with an artillery barrage that survivors described as apocalyptic. From north of the city, General Alexander Vatutin's southwest front launched its assault against Romanian positions near Serafimovich. Simultaneously, General Konstantin Rokossovsky's Don front attacked from the southeast. The Romanian divisions, although brave, could not withstand the weight of concentrated armor and mechanized infantry. Soviet tanks, the sturdy T-34 and lighter machines, burst through defensive lines in echelon formations, with rifle divisions following in their wake. German commanders, including Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, watched with mounting alarm as their carefully constructed positions simply ceased to exist. The Romanian forces fought, but they lacked the anti-tank weapons and the operational doctrine to defeat a mechanized assault of this magnitude. Within days, the initial Soviet penetration had shattered the northern flank of the German position. Zhukov coordinated the offensive with an exactitude that astonished his staff. Reinforcements were fed into the breakthrough at precisely the moment when momentum threatened to stall. Additional armor was redirected to exploit unexpected gaps in German defenses, and logistical support materialized from seemingly nowhere to sustain the advance. By the 23rd of November, just 4 days after the offensive began, the Soviet spearheads from the north and south had linked up near the town of Kalash, roughly 90 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The link-up was not accidental or fortunate. It was the deliberate culmination of Zhukov's operational plan, executed with mechanical precision by commanders who understood their orders and possessed the means to fulfill them. The encirclement was now complete. Trapped within the shrinking perimeter were the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, elements of the German Fourth Panzer Army, and numerous supporting Romanian and Italian units. The trapped forces numbered more than 300,000 soldiers, along with thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and horses. They were surrounded on all sides by Soviet forces that now outnumbered them decisively. The weather was turning colder with each passing day, and the landscape was barren steppe, offering no shelter and no concealment. German commanders immediately recognized the catastrophe. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding Army Group Don, understood that the encircled forces must either break out to the west or be relieved by a powerful counterattack. Paulus radioed Hitler for permission to attempt a breakout. Hitler refused. The Führer issued orders that Sixth Army must hold its ground and await rescue. What followed was a nightmare of a different character. Zhukov now faced a choice that would define his role in the operation: contain the encirclement while defeating German relief attempts, or constrict the pocket and destroy the trapped force outright. He chose the first course. Soviet forces established a containing force around the perimeter of the encirclement, while simultaneously preparing to repel the German relief effort that everyone knew would come. Field Marshal von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm in early December, driving northeastward from positions far to the southwest. German panzer divisions, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Corps, hurled themselves at the Soviet containment line with desperate fury. For nearly 2 weeks, the battle raged in the steppes south of Stalingrad. Soviet commanders, fighting under Zhukov's overall coordination, held their ground despite ferocious German assaults. The relief attempt never penetrated more than roughly 30 kilometers into Soviet territory before it stalled, exhausted and bloodied. By mid-December, it was clear that no relief was coming. The trapped German forces were condemned to either surrender or destruction. Hitler ordered Sixth Army to fight to the last man. No surrender would be permitted. Zhukov and Vasilevsky now turned their attention to compressing the perimeter and bringing the encircled forces to breaking point. Throughout January 1943, the Soviet forces systematically contracted the pocket containing the German Sixth Army. Zhukov directed a series of coordinated assaults from multiple directions, each one designed to reduce the territory available to the trapped Germans and to destroy supplies that could sustain the encircled force. The German soldiers, lacking adequate food, fuel, and ammunition, suffered increasingly from hunger and cold. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing, and without proper shelter or supplies, men began dying, not from combat wounds, but from exposure and starvation. Soviet artillery intensified its bombardment of the shrinking perimeter. Luftwaffe transport planes attempted to resupply the trapped army, but the tonnage delivered never approached what was needed. Zhukov's forces harassed the airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and shooting down transports in flight. German soldiers, aware that their situation was hopeless, began surrendering in increasing numbers. Soviet offers of surrender were made repeatedly. General Paulus, seeing no alternative, finally agreed to capitulate. On the 2nd of February 1943, Paulus and the remains of the German Sixth Army laid down their weapons. The total number of prisoners taken exceeded 90,000 men, most of them severely weakened by malnutrition and exposure. The cost of Zhukov's victory, however, was staggering beyond comprehension. Soviet forces had sustained casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands during the entire Stalingrad campaign, killed, wounded, and missing combined. The operation had consumed vast quantities of ammunition, fuel, and supplies that had taken months to accumulate. Entire divisions had been destroyed or reduced to skeleton formations. The human toll, when measured against the available resources of the Soviet Union, was almost incomprehensible. Each German soldier, encircled and destroyed, had cost the Soviet forces multiple lives. Yet from a strategic perspective, the victory was absolute. The German Wehrmacht had suffered a catastrophic defeat. More than 300,000 soldiers had been killed, captured, or destroyed. Entire German formations had ceased to exist. The myth of German invincibility, already damaged by earlier setbacks, had been shattered definitively. The news of the Stalingrad encirclement rippled outward across the world. Soviet propaganda seized upon the victory with jubilation. German civilians, receiving the news through official channels, experienced a shock that many historians mark as the moment when German confidence in ultimate victory began to erode. Neutral nations noted the shift in momentum. The Wehrmacht, which had seemed unstoppable just months earlier, could now be surrounded and destroyed. Zhukov emerged from the Stalingrad operation, transformed in the eyes of both Soviet leadership and the international military community. He had not merely won a battle, he had orchestrated a fundamental shift in the balance of power between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Stalin, watching the encirclement unfold and observing the destruction of the trapped German force, recognized that his military had acquired a strategist capable of defeating the Wehrmacht at its own game. Zhukov's ability to concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point, his mastery of mechanized warfare, his coordination of multiple fronts acting in concert, these attributes had proven decisive. the general's prestige rose substantially within the Soviet hierarchy. Vasilevsky, his principal collaborator on the operation, also gained in standing. But Zhukov was clearly the architect of victory. His word carried weight in planning sessions. His views on strategy were sought and respected. He had survived not only the military crises of the early war period, but also Stalin's suspicion and paranoia. He had proven himself indispensable to Soviet victory, which offered a certain protection even in a system where indispensability could be a dangerous quality. The broader implications of Uranus extended far beyond the immediate destruction of the German Sixth Army. The operation established a template for Soviet offensive operations that would characterize the remainder of the war. The concentration of massive reserves, the breakthrough of enemy lines at selected points, the rapid exploitation of breakthroughs with mobile formations, and the encirclement and destruction of trapped forces. This operational method, which Zhukov would refine and perfect through successive campaigns, represented a synthesis of Imperial Russian military tradition with modern mechanized warfare. It was not innovation so much as a particular marriage of doctrinal thinking and material abundance. The Soviets had sacrificed so much to acquire the industrial capacity to produce tanks, aircraft, and artillery in quantities that allowed this method of warfare. Zhukov understood this reality and built his strategy around it. German commanders, facing diminishing resources and manpower, could not match this approach. The Wehrmacht would fight brilliantly in defense and in limited counterattacks, but from Stalingrad forward, the Soviets held the initiative and would not relinquish it. The human cost of the Stalingrad operation, taken in its entirety from the initial German penetration to the final Soviet encirclement, numbered in the millions when combined casualties of both sides were calculated. Soviet historical accounts have sometimes obscured the true cost of their victories, preferring to emphasize the destruction of enemy forces while downplaying the losses sustained by Soviet units. Zhukov's operational brilliance could not erase the fact that Soviet soldiers had purchased their victories with blood on a scale that staggers modern understanding. Yet from the perspective of total war, the calculus was inescapable. Every German soldier destroyed in the encirclement was a soldier who could not fight again. Every piece of German equipment captured or destroyed was equipment that could not be replaced easily. Every German formation annihilated was a formation that would have to be rebuilt, consuming time and resources that Germany did not possess in abundance. Zhukov understood this arithmetic with clarity. He would wage war according to its brutal mathematics for the remainder of the conflict, always seeking to maximize enemy losses while accepting Soviet losses as the price of victory. The encirclement at Stalingrad established this pattern definitively. As winter deepened and the German Sixth Army perished in the ruins of Stalingrad, Zhukov was already thinking forward to the next operation, the next front, the next encirclement. The Wehrmacht would attempt to restore the situation in southern Russia, and German commanders would develop ambitious plans for new offensives. But those offensives would occur on terrain that Zhukov had selected, against defenses that he had prepared, and with the initiative resting firmly in Soviet hands. Stalingrad had been won not only through courage and sacrifice, but through superior operational planning and the ruthless concentration of material superiority at the decisive point. These principles would guide Zhukov through the remainder of the war, carrying him from the frozen ruins of Stalingrad across the steppes of Ukraine, through the forests of Belarus, and finally into the heart of Germany itself. The encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army had been destroyed, and the Soviet Union, having paid an almost incomprehensible price, had proven that it could not only survive German assault, but could strike back with overwhelming force. Zhukov had become the instrument of that proof. In the spring of 1943, as the mud of the Russian Rasputitsa began to dry beneath the warming sun, both the German Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army prepared for what they knew would be the largest tank engagement in human history. The geography of the moment was simple but consequential. A vast bulge in the front line, a Soviet salient near the city of Kursk, jutted westward into German-held territory like an extended chin awaiting a punch. The Germans intended to strike from north and south simultaneously, pinching off this salient and encircling the Soviet forces within it, a grand strategy born from the success of earlier encirclements, now pursued with the desperation of a military force that had learned it could no longer count on easy victory. Yet by the spring of that year, Georgy Zhukov possessed something that had eluded German commanders: perfect knowledge of enemy intentions. Soviet intelligence networks, cultivated through years of espionage and signal interception, had delivered to him the complete German operational plan. He knew the timing, he knew the force concentrations, he knew the objectives, and he would turn this knowledge into the most deliberate defensive victory in modern warfare. The intelligence picture had come together gradually, but with devastating clarity. Soviet agents operating within the German military establishment, a network that included even officers on the general staff, had reported on German preparations for what the Wehrmacht called Operation Citadel, the German name for this great summer offensive. By late May, Zhukov had enough confirmation from multiple sources that he could stake his reputation on the accuracy of the information. The Germans would launch their attack around the beginning of July, with Army Group Center striking from the north under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, and Army Group South attacking from the south under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Waiting for them would be not a surprised and panicked Soviet defense, but a carefully constructed fortress of concrete, steel, and prepared positions that had been under construction for months. Zhukov, along with his closest collaborator, General Alexander Vasilevsky, and the capable General Konstantin Rokossovsky, had orchestrated the construction of what Soviet military planners called the Kursk belts, a series of concentric defensive lines that extended backward from the salient's forward edge into progressively deeper layers of prepared positions. These defensive belts represented an almost medieval conception transplanted into the modern age of mechanized warfare. The first belt consisted of anti-tank positions, machine gun nests, and fortified command posts arrayed to break up any German armor attack and extract the maximum cost before falling back. The second belt lay several kilometers behind the first, similarly prepared with anti-tank guns positioned to engage enemy armor in crossfire, with infantry dug into earthwork positions and camouflaged gun emplacements. A third belt, a fourth, sometimes a fifth. The depth of Soviet defensive preparation was staggering in its scope. Zhukov had allocated enormous resources to this single sector, withdrawing units from other areas of the front and concentrating them in this one critical zone. The numerical odds were formidable. Soviet forces in the salient numbered roughly 1.9 million soldiers, positioned across a defending front, with reserves positioned to deliver counterattacks against the German spearheads once they had become entangled in the defensive belts. Against them, the Germans could muster perhaps 900,000 troops, with approximately 3,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. By raw mathematics, the Soviet advantage was substantial, but Zhukov's genius lay not merely in defending, it lay in recognizing that defense could become offense, that a prepared defensive position could be the launching point for a devastating counterattack. The German plan, for all its boldness, rested on an assumption that had grown increasingly fragile over 18 months of brutal warfare. That German coordination, German armor quality, and German tactical skill could overcome Soviet numerical superiority. Field Marshal von Manstein, one of the Wehrmacht's most capable commanders, would drive north from the south with the 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, attempting to pierce the Soviet defenses and link up with von Kluge's forces driving south. The Germans had assembled their finest units for this operation, the elite SS Panzer Corps. The best-equipped formations in the German army were positioned in von Manstein's sector. They possessed the new Tiger tanks, the Ferdinand tank destroyers, and the Panther tanks, formidable vehicles that represented the cutting edge of German armor development. Yet for all this technological sophistication, the Germans were driving into a trap that had been prepared with meticulous care, a trap whose every dimension was known to the commander orchestrating Soviet operations. Zhukov had even positioned his reserves in locations chosen specifically to intercept German armor once it had committed to its attack and become vulnerable to flanking counterattacks. When the Germans finally launched Operation Citadel on the 5th of July, 1943, they encountered something fundamentally different from the desperate improvisation that had characterized earlier German offensives against the Soviet Union. Instead of panicked withdrawal and local tactical defeats that invited exploitation, they met methodical, prepared resistance. The anti-tank guns of the 1st Defensive Belt opened fire at maximum effective range, killing tanks before German armor could close to effective firing distances. As German armor pressed deeper into the Soviet defenses, it encountered successive waves of prepared positions, each one sapping German momentum and inflicting cumulative casualties. The famous panzers that had once seemed invincible now found themselves grinding forward against an enemy that neither panicked nor withdrew, but instead inflicted horrible casualties while withdrawing in good order to the next prepared position. The Germans, despite their tactical skill and the quality of their equipment, were experiencing something they had rarely encountered in nearly 2 years of war in the Soviet Union: a deliberate, methodical defensive battle where numerical superiority and firepower concentration seemed to confer advantage on the defender. On the northern sector, von Kluge's advance became bogged down almost immediately. Soviet defenses under General Rokossovsky proved extraordinarily deep and stubbornly held. German forces made only marginal territorial gains measured in kilometers, advances that cost them dearly in tanks, assault guns, and irreplaceable personnel. By mid-July, the German offensive in the north had effectively stalled, its momentum exhausted, before it could achieve even a fraction of its operational objectives. The southern assault under von Manstein proved more formidable and penetrated deeper into Soviet positions. But even there, progress slowed as German armor encountered successive defensive belts and Soviet reserves positioned for counterattack. The famous Tiger tanks, so fearsome in earlier engagements, found themselves engaged in grinding battles of attrition rather than mobile warfare, their technical advantages negated by the prepared nature of Soviet positions and the sheer number of Soviet anti-tank guns concentrated in the sector. As German momentum slowed, Soviet commanders launched their prepared counteroffensives, operations that had been planned and rehearsed for weeks. Zhukov's strategic genius revealed itself in the timing and scale of these counterattacks. Rather than permit the Germans to define the battle through their offensive operations, Soviet forces launched their own offensives against German forces to the north and south of the Kursk salient, at points where German defenses were thin because reserves had been stripped to reinforce the drive into Kursk itself. Operation Kutuzov struck German forces north of Kursk, while Operation Polkovodets Suvorov, named after the great Russian general of the 18th century, struck German positions to the south. These operations were coordinated with the defense of the salient itself, a three-dimensional chess game at the scale of millions of soldiers. German reserves, committed to sustaining the Kursk offensive, found themselves unable to reinforce threatened sectors elsewhere along the front. Von Manstein requested additional troops and tank reinforcements, but none were available. They were all committed in the grinding struggle against Soviet defensive belts. The Wehrmacht, so recently the master of mobile warfare, found itself increasingly static and reactive, responding to Soviet moves rather than dictating their own operational tempo. By late July, it had become clear to German high command that Operation Citadel had fundamentally failed. The grand strategy of encirclement and annihilation had run aground against Soviet defenses that refused to break. The territorial gains made were minimal, perhaps 30 kilometers at maximum penetration, nowhere near sufficient to achieve the operational objectives of encircling and destroying the Soviet salient. Meanwhile, German losses mounted steadily. Tanks damaged and destroyed, soldiers killed and wounded, supply lines strained to the breaking point. Perhaps more importantly for the Germans, the strategic initiative had shifted permanently to Soviet hands. No longer would the Wehrmacht dictate the pace and location of major operations. From this point forward, the Red Army would seize the initiative and impose its own operational vision on the theater of war. Zhukov, more than any other Soviet commander, was the architect of this transformation. He had recognized that by defending in depth, concentrating reserves, and preparing counter-offensives in advance, he could absorb the strongest blow the Wehrmacht could deliver and transform that blow's failure into opportunity for Soviet offensive operations. The Battle of Kursk also represented something more subtle but equally significant: the destruction of a myth that had animated German military culture since the invasion began. The myth held that German officers and soldiers possessed a tactical and operational superiority that could overcome Soviet numerical advantages, that German armor and training could prevail in any engagement if properly concentrated and skillfully handled. The grinding, methodical Battle of Kursk demonstrated that this mythology had no basis in reality. Soviet commanders, given adequate intelligence, sufficient time to prepare, and numerical superiority, could not merely defeat German forces, they could defeat them decisively while accepting a smaller casualty ratio than had been true in earlier engagements. The myth of German military superiority died in the mud and dust of the Kursk salient in July 1943, broken by Zhukov's strategic vision and the competence of Soviet officers who executed his plans with growing confidence. In the aftermath of Kursk, Zhukov's authority within Soviet military circles became nearly absolute. Stalin, watching as his most capable field commander delivered strategic victory after strategic victory, gradually granted him greater autonomy in planning and executing major operations. The dynamic between Stalin and Zhukov was complex and dangerous. Zhukov understood that he existed at Stalin's sufferance, that one misstep could result in dismissal or worse. Yet within this constrained space, Zhukov maneuvered with increasing freedom, transforming Soviet military operations into models of coordination and concentration of force on a scale unprecedented in military history. The Red Army, once a ragtag collection of desperate units fighting for survival, had evolved under Zhukov's direction into a mechanized force capable of coordinating movements of millions of soldiers across vast distances with precision and purpose. Kursk was the point at which this evolution became undeniable and irreversible, the moment when even Stalin had to acknowledge that his greatest military asset was not merely competent, but perhaps the most capable military strategist of the age. The human cost of Kursk was staggering, as was true of all Soviet military operations. Estimates of Soviet casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, in the Kursk salient and the associated operations ran to hundreds of thousands, figures that seemed almost abstract when written as numbers, but represented incomprehensible human suffering. Yet the battle possessed a significance that transcended its immediate tactical results. Kursk demonstrated that the Soviet Union had learned the bitter lessons of 2 years of catastrophic military failure and transformed those lessons into operational and strategic competence. The desperate armies that had suffered encirclement and destruction in 1941 had evolved into forces capable of absorbing the Wehrmacht's strongest blow, breaking it against prepared defences, and immediately launching devastating counteroffensives. This transformation of defeat into mastery was not the work of a single commander, but it was orchestrated and directed by Zhukov more than any other individual. From Kursk forward, the trajectory of the war became inevitable. Soviet forces would advance westward, liberating territory and expanding Soviet influence across Eastern Europe, until they finally stood in Berlin itself, victorious and unchallengeable in the military sphere. By the autumn of 1943, something fundamental had shifted in the Soviet war machine. The Red Army was no longer reacting to German initiative, it was seizing it. The catastrophes of 1941 and 1942 had been transformed through blood and experience into operational mastery. And at the center of this transformation stood Georgy Zhukov, a man who had evolved from crisis manager into something far more consequential, the strategic architect of Soviet victory. Where once he had shuttled frantically between collapsing fronts, dispensing orders to salvage the unsalvageable, he now orchestrated operations of such scale and complexity that they would define modern warfare itself. Millions of soldiers, thousands of kilometers of frontline coordination across multiple armies operating in concert. These were no longer desperate improvisations but carefully choreographed campaigns. Zhukov had become the mind behind the machine, and that machine was growing more efficient and devastating by the month. The transformation was not born from theory or doctrine alone. It emerged from the grimly practical education of catastrophic failure. Every encirclement at Kiev, every rout at Kharkov, every frozen retreat across the steppes had taught Zhukov lessons that no peacetime military academy could provide. He understood, viscerally and without illusion, the true nature of mechanized warfare, that it was not about heroism or individual brilliance, but about coordination, logistics, and the ability to concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point. Where the Germans had built their strategy on the audacious strike, the lightning thrust that shattered enemy cohesion before they could respond, Zhukov was constructing something different. He was building strategy on depth, on reserves, on the ability to absorb punishment and then respond with coordinated blows from multiple directions that the enemy could not simultaneously parry. This was not the doctrine of genius transcending limitations. It was the doctrine of a commander who had learned to use the enormous resources of the Soviet Union with precision and discipline. The intelligence apparatus became one of Zhukov's most lethal weapons, a capability the Wehrmacht had fatally underestimated. Soviet intelligence networks, both human and technical, were providing Zhukov with detailed information about German dispositions, intentions, and even operational timelines. At Kursk in July 1943, This intelligence advantage became decisive. Zhukov knew in advance that the Germans intended Operation Citadel, the attempt to pinch off a Soviet salient by attacking from north and south simultaneously. Rather than being surprised, Zhukov had months to prepare a response. He constructed concentric defensive belts of extraordinary depth, layering anti-tank guns, mines, and artillery positions in a defensive system designed to absorb and break the German assault. The confidence this knowledge gave him was absolute. He was not hoping the Germans would fail. He was constructing the conditions to make their failure inevitable. When the panzers attacked, they crashed against prepared defenses that had been refined and reinforced precisely because Zhukov knew they were coming. Logistics had become Zhukov's obsession, and for good reason. A German general might plan a brilliant encirclement, but if the trucks that carried ammunition and supplies could not keep pace with the panzer divisions, the operation would fail in the mud. Zhukov had witnessed this repeatedly. German advances that ran out of fuel, that consumed their supplies faster than they could be replenished, that ultimately collapsed, not because they faced superior opposition, but because the supply lines could not sustain them. He was determined that Soviet operations would not suffer the same fate. He built railway networks methodically, stockpiling ammunition, fuel, and replacement troops at rear areas before operations commenced. He understood that 100 kilometers of advance meant nothing if the army that advanced it was exhausted and unsupplied. This obsession with logistics, which might have seemed tedious or excessive to a more romantic commander, was in fact the foundation of Soviet victory. It was unglamorous work, counting trucks, calculating fuel consumption, establishing supply depots, but it was the difference between operations that succeeded and operations that dissipated into failure. Deception had become almost an art form in Zhukov's hands. Operation Kutuzov in August 1943 demonstrated this with particular clarity. While German intelligence focused on the apparent Soviet objective of liberating Bryansk, Zhukov was actually executing a far more ambitious and complex operation, with multiple prongs, multiple armies, and objectives that extended far beyond what the Germans believed possible. By the time German commanders understood what was happening, the battle had already been decided. The Germans, deceived about the scale and timing of the Soviet assault, found themselves outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Zhukov had learned that the German General Staff, for all its professional sophistication, could be misled if the deception was thorough and if real military operations were concealed beneath layers of false information and misdirection. He deployed dummy army headquarters, created false radio traffic, and maneuvered substantial forces at night to conceal their true positions. The Germans, facing an enemy that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously, could not concentrate their forces effectively. This mastery of deception allowed Zhukov to achieve surprise even when Soviet intentions were generally understood. The coordination of multiple fronts represented a challenge of almost incomprehensible complexity. Each front was essentially a separate army group, commanded by its own marshal or general, operating across hundreds of kilometers of front line. Yet Zhukov had to ensure that these independent commands acted in concert, that their operations reinforced each other rather than worked at cross purposes. This required not merely excellent communication, difficult enough across vast distances in wartime, but a shared understanding of strategy and a willingness on the part of individual commanders to subordinate their own preferences to the larger plan. Zhukov's authority over these commanders was not absolute. They were politically appointed, some of them possessed their own connections to Stalin, and some were formidable personalities in their own right. Yet through a combination of professional respect, frequent visits to the front, and the demonstrated success of his methods, Zhukov had established a form of command authority that was almost unique in Soviet military life. Commanders obeyed his orders, not out of fear alone, but out of recognition that his plans worked, and that cooperation with his vision led to victory. The scale of the operations Zhukov was orchestrating by 1944 dwarfed anything the war had previously seen. Operation Bagration, which would come in June 1944, would involve more than 2 million Soviet soldiers, coordinated across a front of more than 1,000 kilometers. No commander in history had previously attempted to coordinate an operation of such magnitude, involving such numbers of troops, across such vast distances. Yet Zhukov not only planned it, but executed it with remarkable precision. The operation was divided into multiple phases, each carefully timed to commence as the previous phase achieved its objectives, each designed to prevent German reserves from concentrating at any single point. The entire operation was a masterpiece of choreography. Not rigid choreography that would collapse if one element failed, but choreography with sufficient flexibility to adapt to unexpected circumstances while maintaining the overall strategic objective. This represented a level of operational sophistication that most militaries would not achieve for decades after the war's conclusion. Zhukov's relationship with Stalin had evolved into something more complex than simple obedience. He remained entirely subordinate to the Soviet dictator. No one in Stalin's USSR could afford to be anything else. But he had established a position as Stalin's most trusted military advisor, the one commander whose opinion Stalin seemed genuinely to value. This was partly because Zhukov delivered victories, and partly because Zhukov had demonstrated absolute loyalty despite the purges and dangers that surrounded him. He never challenged Stalin politically, never suggested that military considerations should override political directives, never displayed any ambition toward power beyond the military sphere. Yet he was not servile in the manner of some officers. He would tell Stalin when operations were impossible or when the human cost would be excessive. Stalin appeared to respect this candid assessment, perhaps because it served his purposes. A commander who would deliver hard truths was more useful than one who merely told him what he wanted to hear. The relationship was precarious, as everything in Stalin's court was precarious. But for now, it gave Zhukov the authority to shape Soviet military strategy. The accumulation of experience had taught Zhukov profound lessons about the nature of modern warfare that went far beyond the immediate tactical level. He understood that industrial capacity was as important as military genius, that the Soviet Union's greater production capacity in tanks and artillery was as decisive as any commander's brilliance. He understood that manpower, while vast, was not infinite, and that Soviet strategy had to husband lives even while willing to pay high prices for objectives. He understood that German officer corps, for all their technical sophistication, were operating on shorter operational timelines and with less capacity to sustain prolonged campaigns than the Soviets. The Germans sought rapid decision, knockout blows that would shatter Soviet unity before attrition exhausted their own resources. Zhukov, by contrast, was playing a longer game, building operations that would wear down German forces through attrition while Soviet reserves replenished and strengthened. This difference in strategic perspective, German emphasis on rapid decision versus Soviet emphasis on sustainable attrition, was increasingly shifting the balance of the war. The professionalization of the Soviet General Staff under Zhukov's influence was itself a revolutionary change in Soviet military organization. Where the Red Army had been characterized by political commissars second-guessing military decisions and ideological purity determining promotions, Zhukov was gradually establishing a system in which professional military competence took precedence. Officers were promoted for demonstrated ability, rather than political reliability, and military considerations were given weight in operational planning. This was not a complete transformation. Stalin's political control remained absolute, but within the sphere of military operations, Zhukov had created something approaching a genuinely professional officer corps. This professionalization was not accomplished through any formal reform, but rather through the quiet influence of demonstrated success. Young officers who had been trained during the purges, officers who had never known a system of genuine professional military development, were now receiving that education through service in operations planned by Zhukov. They were learning to think in terms of logistics, coordination, deception, and the judicious use of overwhelming force, rather than in terms of ideological correctness or Stalin's favor. By 1944, Zhukov had achieved a position that was almost unprecedented in Soviet military history. He was not the supreme commander, Stalin held that position, but he was the closest thing the Red Army had to a chief strategist, the man whose vision and planning determined how Soviet military power would be wielded. His authority extended across multiple fronts, his opinions shaped strategic decisions at the highest level, and his proven ability to deliver victories gave him a credibility that few military figures in history have achieved. Yet this very success contained the seeds of future danger. In a state as paranoid as Stalin's Soviet Union, success could be as dangerous as failure, and a military figure too important, too famous, too necessary to the state's survival could become a threat. Zhukov, by his brilliance and his victories, was inadvertently moving toward a confrontation with the very system that had elevated him. For now, however, he was at the height of his powers, commanding the greatest military force in the European theatre, orchestrating operations that would determine the fate of nations. He was the architect of Soviet victory, and the final, overwhelming blows that would destroy Nazi Germany were now being constructed according to his design. By the autumn of 1943, the Soviet war machine had begun to transform from desperate survival into calculated dominance. Zhukov stood at the center of this metamorphosis, no longer merely reacting to German offensives, but orchestrating a sequence of assaults designed to expel the Wehrmacht from Soviet soil entirely. The psychology of warfare had shifted beneath the mud and smoke. Where once the Red Army fought to avoid annihilation, it now fought to annihilate. Where once Soviet commanders learned through catastrophic failure, Zhukov had begun to teach failure to others. The Germans, sensing the shift in momentum after their defeat at Kursk in July, retreated westward in a series of grudging, costly withdrawals. Zhukov, with his characteristic blend of ruthlessness and precision, saw opportunity in this retreat. He would not allow the Wehrmacht breathing room. He would not permit them time to consolidate new defensive lines. Instead, he conceived a chain of offensives that would press relentlessly westward, liberating Soviet territory and destroying German reserves faster than Berlin could replace them. The first of these grand operations emerged from the planning rooms in August 1943, under the name Operation Kutuzov, named after the Russian general who had defeated Napoleon. The symmetry was not accidental. Zhukov understood the power of historical memory, the way names could inspire soldiers and bind them to a tradition of victory. Kutuzov targeted German forces retreating toward Smolensk, the great city that had already been fought over multiple times during the war. The operation was designed as a massive pincer movement, with Soviet forces advancing from north and south simultaneously, attempting to encircle and destroy German Army Group Center's forces before they could establish new defensive positions. Zhukov coordinated multiple fronts: the Western Front under Ivan Konev, the Bryansk Front under Markian Popov, the Central Front soon to be renamed, across an enormous stretch of territory. The coordination required was staggering. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had to move in synchronization. Artillery had to be positioned precisely. Air cover had to be maintained despite German resistance. Yet this was precisely the kind of orchestration at which Zhukov had become expert. What made Kutuzov distinctive was not merely its scale, but its execution under conditions of perpetual friction and incomplete information. The Soviet intelligence services, growing increasingly sophisticated, provided reasonably accurate information about German dispositions and intentions, but uncertainty remained. Weather conditions deteriorated as autumn approached, turning roads into mud rivers that threatened to immobilize Soviet armor. German resistance, though weakening, remained organized and dangerous. Zhukov's commanders reported difficulties in maintaining coordination across such vast distances. Yet Zhukov pressed forward with relentless intensity, adjusting plans in real time as situations evolved. He flew between fronts repeatedly, appearing in person at critical moments to oversee difficult decisions. He combined the role of strategist with the role of troubleshooter, moving problems through the system with the impatience of a man who understood that delay meant continued German occupation of Soviet territory. The operation ultimately succeeded in liberating Smolensk by mid-September, a symbolic victory of enormous importance because Smolensk had been lost to the Germans in the early weeks of Barbarossa. Its recapture represented not merely tactical success, but the beginning of genuine Soviet recovery. Yet Kutuzov was merely the opening movement in a far grander composition. By autumn 1943, with the German army weakened by the Kursk campaign and further drained by Kutuzov, Zhukov recognized that the moment had arrived to launch sustained pressure along the entire Eastern Front. He began planning what would become a cascading series of offensives, stretching across months and hundreds of kilometers. The aim was not merely to push the Germans back, but to destroy their capacity to resist through sheer accumulated pressure and loss. Each operation would be designed to feed into the next, creating a momentum that became self-sustaining. As German reserves were committed to defend one sector, Soviet forces would attack another. As the Germans attempted to stabilize one line, new Soviet assaults would force them to retreat to the next. Zhukov understood that this strategy placed enormous strain on Soviet logistics and on the endurance of Soviet soldiers, but it offered the only path to final victory before the war became so prolonged that Western powers might impose settlements unfavorable to Soviet interests. The series of operations that followed Kutuzov bore witness to Zhukov's evolving sophistication as a strategist. Operation Polkovodets Suvorov in 1944, named after another celebrated Russian military commander, exemplified this evolution. Where earlier operations had sometimes been hampered by rigid adherence to initial plans, Suvorov demonstrated fluid adaptation to changing circumstances. The operation aimed at liberating Ukraine entirely and pushing Soviet forces toward Poland and Romania. Zhukov coordinated an offensive of nearly 2 million soldiers across multiple fronts in the southern and central sectors of the Eastern Front. The coordination involved not merely simultaneous attacks, but carefully timed offensives designed to prevent German reinforcement of threatened sectors. When German forces attempted to establish defensive lines, Soviet forces would either penetrate them or flow around them, forcing the enemy into constant movement and retreat. The Wehrmacht found itself trapped in an exhausting cycle: hold a position until it became untenable, retreat to the next defensive line, only to find Soviet forces already moving to outflank it. What distinguished these operations from earlier Soviet campaigns was the subordination of individual tactical victories to strategic objectives. Zhukov no longer pursued encirclement for its own sake, or sought to maximize the destruction of enemy forces merely to prove Soviet superiority. Instead, he calculated every operation in terms of its contribution to the ultimate goal, the expulsion of German forces from Soviet territory and the positioning of the Red Army for the final assault on Germany itself. This required sometimes accepting situations that seemed tactically incomplete if they contributed strategically to the larger scheme. A German unit that escaped encirclement mattered less than a Soviet force that advanced 50 kilometers westward. A fully destroyed German division meant less than the systematic disintegration of German Army Group Center's defensive capability. This perspective represented maturation as a strategist. Zhukov had learned that warfare was not mathematics, but rather the subtle art of imposing one's will upon an enemy through 1,000 small decisions, each feeding into a larger design. The logistical challenges that accompanied these cascading offensives were almost incomprehensible in scope. Soviet forces had to supply millions of soldiers across distances that stretched hundreds of kilometers from established supply bases. Rail lines frequently ran through recently liberated territory, still bearing the scars of German occupation and Soviet defense. Roads were often destroyed, or barely adequate for the volume of traffic required. Fuel shortages plagued commanders constantly. Ammunition consumption was staggering. Yet the Soviet system, despite its inefficiencies and its tendencies toward waste, proved capable of supporting sustained operations on an unprecedented scale. Zhukov's insistence on logistical preparation before launching offensives, though it sometimes frustrated field commanders eager to attack, ensured that supply lines remained functional even under extreme strain. He understood from bitter experience that operations failed not from lack of courage or tactical brilliance, but from inability to sustain the vast appetite of modern warfare. A commander with perfect tactical sense but inadequate supplies was merely a skilled orchestrator of defeat. Through 1943 and into 1944, the cumulative effect of these operations transformed the military situation entirely. German Army Group Center, once seemingly invincible, was worn down through relentless pressure. German reserves, which had seemed infinite in 1942, became increasingly scarce. German commanders reported mounting casualties, declining morale, and the growing sense that the war was being lost. The initiative, which had passed to Soviet hands after Kursk, now seemed irreversible. Yet Zhukov permitted no complacency. He continued to press, to demand more from his commanders, to insist that objectives be met on schedule. If a commander reported that an operation was falling behind, Zhukov would appear at the front to investigate personally, often with sharp words for those he deemed insufficiently aggressive. His reputation for impatience and harsh judgment became legendary among Soviet officers. Yet this severity served a purpose. It ensured that commanders remained focused on objectives and that the momentum of the Soviet advance never slackened. The human cost of these operations, though less catastrophic than the battles of 1941 and 1942, remained staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers fell in these offensives. Civilian populations in liberated territories had suffered under German occupation and continued to suffer under the conditions of active warfare. Yet from Zhukov's perspective, a perspective shaped by years of total war and the Soviet system's indifference to individual human loss, these costs were justified by the strategic gains achieved. The systematic destruction of German military capacity was the only path to Soviet survival and Soviet dominance of Eastern Europe. The liberation of Soviet territory and Soviet citizens however costly, represented the fulfillment of his duty as a Soviet military commander. This perspective seems callous from the remove of decades, but it reflected the reality of total war in the 1940s, where millions died and where mercy was often impossible. By late 1944, as Soviet forces advanced deeper into Eastern Europe, Zhukov's role began to evolve again. He remained the principal architect of Soviet strategy, but increasingly his attention shifted toward the final assault on Germany itself. The liberation of Soviet territory was nearing completion. Soon, Soviet forces would cross into foreign soil, not as liberators but as conquerors and occupiers. Zhukov began to coordinate planning for the major offensives that would drive Soviet forces into Poland, across the Vistula River, and ultimately toward Berlin itself. These operations would be far larger and far more complex than anything yet attempted. They would require coordination not merely of multiple Soviet fronts, but potentially of Soviet military operations with Western Allied forces. The political dimensions became increasingly important. Stalin increasingly involved himself in military planning, and Zhukov had to navigate the complexity of delivering strategic military advice to a dictator growing ever more confident and ambitious. The operations of 1943 and 1944 represented the apotheosis of mechanized warfare in its Soviet form. Zhukov had pioneered and refined tactics that subordinated brilliant individual maneuver to overwhelming mass and systematic pressure. Where German commanders spoke of elegance and decisiveness in military operations, Zhukov spoke of concentration and sustained pressure. Where German strategists sought economy of force, Zhukov believed in the sledgehammer approach: identify the enemy's weak point and strike it repeatedly with every available resource until it broke. This approach consumed men and material at rates that would have been unthinkable in earlier ages, yet it worked. It worked against an enemy that could not replace its losses. It worked in a context where the Soviet Union, despite its enormous human casualties, had access to greater reserves than Germany. It worked because Zhukov had the authority to implement it ruthlessly and the willingness to accept the costs it demanded. The liberation of Soviet territory through these cascading offensives represented more than military victory. It represented the resurrection of Soviet power from the ashes of 1941. When Barbarossa launched, many observers believed the Soviet Union would collapse within months. Instead, through the efforts of commanders like Zhukov, it had not merely survived, but achieved military dominance. The road from Stalingrad to the outskirts of Berlin was paved with Soviet blood and German defeat. Zhukov had traveled that road, learning its lessons, adapting to its demands, and ultimately mastering the art of coordinating the largest military operations in human history. The operations he orchestrated in 1943 and 1944 demonstrated a commander at the height of his powers, commanding resources beyond measure, and achieving objectives that seemed impossible merely 2 years earlier. Yet as Soviet forces approached German territory, new challenges emerged. Military victory alone would not determine the post-war order. Political calculations and Stalin's ambitions would increasingly shape how Zhukov's military genius would be deployed in the final phases of the European war. In the spring of 1944, the Red Army stood at a threshold. Behind lay 4 years of survival against annihilation, of learning mechanized warfare through bitter defeats and costly victories. Ahead lay the prospect of total victory, the complete destruction of Nazi Germany, and the liberation of Soviet territory. Yet between spring and summer, a crucial question hung over the Soviet High Command: how to deliver the final blow. The answer would come not from Moscow's ministries, but from the mind of Georgy Zhukov, who now orchestrated strategy at a scale that exceeded anything the world had yet witnessed. In June, as American and British forces waded ashore on the beaches of Normandy, Zhukov was preparing something different, something that would reshape the war's trajectory and prove that Soviet military power had become a force of nature itself. Operation Bagration was not born from impulse. It emerged from months of careful planning, conducted in the encrypted rooms of the Kremlin, where Zhukov and his deputy, Alexander Vasilevsky, had studied German dispositions, supply lines, and the rigid thinking of a Wehrmacht command that could no longer adapt to Soviet innovation. The operation's target was German Army Group Center, the military formation that had spearheaded the invasion of 1941 and had somehow survived 4 years of relentless Soviet pressure. By the spring of 1944, Army Group Center held a massive salient in Belarus, roughly 400 kilometers across, garrisoned by more than 3 million troops under the command of Field Marshal Ernst Busch. The Germans believed the salient secure. Intelligence suggested that the next major Soviet offensive would strike elsewhere, perhaps toward the Baltic or southward through Ukraine. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, born of German contempt for Soviet capabilities and years of experience fighting a Red Army that seemed perpetually weaker than themselves. Zhukov would exploit this misreading with ruthless precision. The scale of Bagration defied comprehension, even by the standards of modern warfare. The operation would engage approximately 2.5 million Soviet soldiers across 4 major fronts, supported by more than 2,000 aircraft, roughly 5,000 tanks, and more than 40,000 artillery pieces. The concentration of force was overwhelming. Entire armies positioned to strike simultaneously across a front so vast that a single commander could not possibly observe it all. Yet this was precisely where Zhukov excelled. He had learned, through 4 years of catastrophe and success, how to coordinate operations across space that would have paralyzed commanders of earlier generations. He had mastered the art of deception as well, spreading rumors that a major offensive would come northward toward the Baltic to draw German reserves away from the true strike zone. Soviet engineers constructed elaborate false encampments complete with dummy tanks and fake radio traffic. The Germans took the bait with stunning ease. By the time Bagration launched on the 23rd of June, German Army Group Center was positioned exactly where Zhukov wanted it, forward, exposed, and catastrophically unprepared for the assault that was about to crash down upon it. The operation began not with the massive infantry attacks that had characterized Soviet warfare in earlier years, but with coordinated strikes designed to atomize German command and control. Soviet aircraft attacked German airfields, destroying hundreds of enemy planes on the ground and claiming air superiority so complete that German pilots reported Soviet dominance with a kind of shocked disbelief. Artillery bombardments of unprecedented intensity, some Soviet guns firing hundreds of rounds per day, obliterated German defensive positions and killed thousands of soldiers in their trenches before a single Soviet infantryman advanced. This was mechanized warfare at its apotheosis, the marriage of armor, air power, and artillery orchestrated with precision that left no room for improvisation or chance. The Wehrmacht faced something radically different from the Soviet tactics of earlier years. This was not a frontal battering ram but a surgical strike, probing for weakness, finding it, and then expanding the breach with overwhelming force. German General Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center, sent desperate messages to Berlin requesting reinforcement and authorization to withdraw to more defensible positions. The response from Hitler was predictable and disastrous. hold at all costs. There would be no retreat, no tactical flexibility, no recognition that the situation had become militarily hopeless. Within the first week of Bagration, Soviet forces had achieved breakthrough on multiple sectors. The German Ninth Army, commanded by Walter Model, found itself surrounded as Soviet mechanized columns poured through gaps in the German lines at speeds that the Wehrmacht High Command could scarcely track. Zhukov's armies moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy the constraints of space and supply. Where earlier Soviet offensives had ground to a halt after covering hundreds of kilometers due to exhausted supply lines and overextended advances, these armies maintained momentum. This was the fruit of Zhukov's obsession with logistics. He had insisted that the Red Army's rear services be rebuilt with the same professionalism as its combat formations, that trucks and rail lines and ammunition depots be managed with the precision of a great industrial enterprise. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was struggling. German supply lines were breaking under air attack. Rail lines were repeatedly cut by Soviet partisans. Fuel shortages meant that even the formidable German panzer forces could not maneuver freely. German counterattacks, when they came, were fragmented and desperate, attempting to restore order to a situation that was spiraling beyond German control with horrifying speed. By early July, Zhukov's armies had encircled and trapped the German Third and Fourth Armies in a pocket near Minsk, the capital of Belarus. More than 400,000 German soldiers found themselves surrounded by converging Soviet forces, and once again, German command received the same order from Hitler: break out or die in place. Many chose to fight, and the resulting battles were fierce and confused, with desperate German columns attempting to punch through Soviet lines, while Soviet forces tightened the noose with inexorable patience. The Minsk pocket would eventually be reduced. Soviet soldiers found the city burned and destroyed, a monument to German occupation and Soviet liberation. The casualties on both sides were staggering, but this time, the losses favored Soviet strategy. For every German soldier killed or captured, the Red Army lost fewer men, and crucially, the Wehrmacht could not replace them. The German soldier was now a finite resource, and Zhukov was spending German manpower like a man who knew Germany was bankrupt. The offensive did not stop at Minsk. This was the secret of Zhukov's genius: his refusal to allow the German army breathing room to reorganize and counterattack. Soviet forces continued pushing westward throughout July and August, rolling over German positions that had been prepared and then abandoned when German High Command ordered yet another futile stand. The progress was so rapid that Soviet supply lines genuinely struggled to keep pace. Frontline soldiers reported marching forward so quickly that they could see the dust clouds of their own supply trucks disappearing behind them. Tank commanders pushed their machines to mechanical limits, driving through the night to maintain contact with retreating German forces. The Red Army was not marching according to a predetermined timetable, but rather pursuing a disintegrating enemy with an aggressiveness that bordered on recklessness. Yet it worked. By the end of August, Soviet forces had driven westward more than 500 kilometers, liberated Belarus entirely, and positioned themselves to threaten the Baltic states and Poland itself. Army Group Center, the formation that had invaded the Soviet Union, had been effectively destroyed. German casualty figures varied, but conservative estimates placed German losses at approximately 400,000 killed, wounded, or captured in the Bagration operation. Soviet losses were roughly comparable in absolute numbers, but the Soviets could absorb them. Germany could not. The political consequences of Bagration reverberated across occupied Europe. Millions of Soviet citizens were being liberated from German rule, and with liberation came confirmation of the horrors of occupation. Soviet soldiers advancing through Belarus found evidence of systematic murder, forced labor, and the methodical destruction of civilian populations. The psychological impact on Red Army soldiers was profound. They were fighting not merely for ideology or patriotism, but in response to personal knowledge of atrocity. They were liberating their own homeland, destroying the occupier that had killed their families and burned their villages. This emotional force, channeled through Zhukov's military discipline, created a weapon of exceptional potency. The Wehrmacht faced not merely a larger army, but an army filled with burning determination to annihilate the enemy that had invaded their country. German soldiers, meanwhile, were beginning to understand that the war was lost. They were withdrawing toward Germany itself, and no amount of German military skill could compensate for Soviet numbers, Soviet determination, and the fact that Germany's industrial base was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing from the West. Zhukov surveyed the results of Bagration with satisfaction, but without celebration. He understood that victory, while complete, had come at horrifying cost. Soviet casualty figures, killed, wounded and missing, exceeded 400,000 men. Entire villages in Belarus had been destroyed. The psychological scars of occupation would mark Soviet survivors for generations. Yet from a purely military perspective, Bagration represented the apex of his achievement. He had orchestrated an operation of unparalleled scale, coordinated the movements of millions of soldiers across hundreds of kilometers, maintained concentration of force against a capable enemy, and achieved complete victory. He had done this while managing Stalin, a man of paranoid temperament and volatile judgment, and while integrating the lessons of 4 years of brutal warfare into a coherent military doctrine. The operation proved beyond doubt that the Soviet Union possessed not merely the manpower to defeat Germany, but the military genius required to translate that manpower into victory. In the aftermath of Bagration, Zhukov's authority within the Soviet system was absolute. He was no longer merely the general who managed crises or coordinated desperate defenses. He was the architect of Soviet victory, the man whose strategic vision had transformed a nation on the edge of destruction into the war's dominant power. Politicians deferred to his judgment. Officers obeyed without question. Stalin, while remaining formally in supreme command, essentially allowed Zhukov to plan and execute the remaining operations that would bring German defeat. The final year of the war in Europe would see Soviet forces advancing relentlessly westward, driven by momentum that Zhukov had created in the summer of 1944. The path from Bagration to Berlin was still long and filled with fierce fighting, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Zhukov had broken the Wehrmacht's capacity for serious resistance in the east. Now it remained only for Soviet forces to consolidate that victory and march toward Germany's heart. Bagration also represented something more subtle, the moment when the Soviet Union truly became the war's decisive power in the European theater. Yes, American and British forces were fighting in Normandy and pushing eastward through France. Yes, the strategic bombing campaign was gradually crippling German industry. But the Red Army under Zhukov's command was doing the fundamental work of defeating Nazi Germany, destroying the Wehrmacht in open battle, liberating territory, and positioning itself to dictate the peace. In the conferences between Soviet, British, and American leaders that would follow in the latter half of 1944 and into 1945, Stalin would negotiate from a position of overwhelming strength. Soviet soldiers were dying in greater numbers than any other combatant, but they were winning. Zhukov had made certain of that through military brilliance, ruthlessness, and an almost superhuman capacity to manage complexity while remaining responsive to changing circumstances. As summer became autumn in 1944, Zhukov began planning the next phase of operations, the Vistula-Oder offensive that would carry Soviet forces to within striking distance of Berlin itself. But he did so knowing that his greatest test might still lie ahead. The Red Army was now pursuing Germany into its own territory, where the Wehrmacht would fight with the desperation of a nation facing extinction. The final battles would be the most savage, the most costly, and the most significant. Zhukov was preparing for them with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made Bagration a masterpiece of military execution. He knew that the war would end on Soviet terms, but he did not yet know the full price that victory would demand. The winter of 1945 arrives like a judge descending from an unseen height. Across Eastern Europe, the landscape transforms into something vast and inhospitable. Snow blankets the flat plains of Poland and Hungary in white monotony, rendering movement difficult for foot soldiers and supply wagons alike. Yet it is precisely in this frozen, desolate season that Zhukov prepares to deliver the blow that will bring Soviet forces to Germany's doorstep. The Vistula River, winding northward through Polish territory, represents the last major natural barrier between the Red Army and Berlin. Beyond that line lies the Reich itself, weakened, desperate, stripped of reserves that have been consumed in the futile defense of every preceding Soviet offensive. Zhukov understands this geometry of power perfectly. He will not hesitate. The winter, though cruel, presents an advantage. The frozen earth can support the weight of armor in ways autumn mud cannot. Supply lines, once established, can function with brutal efficiency across frozen ground. For an army that has mastered the coordination of millions, winter becomes not obstacle, but opportunity. The strategic picture in early 1945 is one of German collapse in slow motion. The Wehrmacht has lost the initiative permanently. In the north, German forces remain bogged down in East Prussia, trapped by Red Army advances that have already cost them enormous casualties. In the center, German defenses along the Vistula are manned by exhausted troops, many of them conscripted late in the war from reluctant civilian populations. In the south, German forces push backward under the weight of multiple Soviet offensives in Hungary and toward Vienna. Hitler, isolated in his bunker, issues orders that bear no relation to tactical reality. He demands counter-offensives with forces that no longer exist in meaningful numbers. He forbids withdrawals that would preserve troops for future defense. He commits to holding every meter of ground, guaranteeing that German soldiers will perish in static positions rather than inflict casualties in a mobile defense. Zhukov sees through all of this. He has spent 4 years learning to read German strategy, recognizing its patterns and anticipating its desperation. The Germans have nothing left with which to surprise him. They have no strategic reserves of consequence. Their air force has been reduced to a shadow by Soviet air superiority. Their tank production cannot match Soviet manufacturing capacity. The only question remaining is not whether the Red Army will reach Berlin, but how quickly and at what cost. Planning for the Vistula-Oder offensive begins in December 1944, coordinated from Soviet headquarters with the precision that has become Zhukov's trademark. He must synchronize attacks across enormous frontages, his forces stretched across hundreds of kilometers in multiple army groups, each containing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The offensive will involve the First Belarusian Front under Konstantin Rokossovsky and the First Ukrainian Front under Ivan Konev, two of the Red Army's most capable commanders, yet both ultimately answerable to Zhukov's coordinating authority. The operational plan itself is a masterwork of logistical choreography. Supplies must be amassed. Ammunition, fuel, replacement vehicles, medical supplies, rations for soldiers advancing across frozen ground, and positioned behind the lines in quantities sufficient to sustain a rapid westward advance. Railroads, themselves targets of German air attack and sabotage, must function with mechanical reliability. Transport vehicles, many of them American-made Studebaker trucks provided through Lend-Lease, must be maintained and fueled. Artillery must be concentrated in sufficient numbers to overwhelm German defensive lines in coordinated barrages that break through in hours rather than days. Armor must be positioned to exploit breakthroughs, driving westward with speed that prevents German commanders from establishing new defensive positions. Every element must function in concert. A single failure in supply or coordination could slow the advance by days, allowing German forces to reorganize and inflict greater casualties. The assault begins on the 12th of January 1945, with devastating artillery bombardment along the Vistula front. Soviet guns, thousands of them, stretching across miles of prepared positions, launch fire upon German defensive lines with the accumulated experience of 4 years of total war. The barrage is not merely violent, it is surgical in its precision. Artillery spotters, coordinated through modern communications, adjust fire based on observed results. Soviet gunnery has evolved from the crude, wasteful methods of 1941 into something resembling a science. German soldiers in forward positions, huddled in inadequate fortifications, experience bombardment of such intensity that many are rendered combat ineffective before infantry assault even begins. Survivors emerge dazed, their hearing damaged, their capacity for organized resistance shattered. When Soviet infantry assault troops cross the frozen Vistula, wading through water barely above their knees, they encounter defenders already broken by artillery. Some German positions fall with minimal resistance. Others demand fierce close-quarter combat in ruined villages and improvised strongpoints. Yet nowhere along the vast frontage do German defenders manage to stabilize a coherent line. The sheer weight of Soviet assault, the concentration of force that Zhukov has pioneered and perfected, simply overwhelms available German resources. Within days of the initial assault, Soviet forces establish bridgeheads across the Vistula in multiple locations, and engineers begin constructing pontoon bridges capable of supporting armor. This is when the offensive transitions from breakthrough to exploitation, the moment when mechanized Soviet forces begin their westward drive. Tank brigades, supported by motorized rifle divisions, push across frozen Polish landscape with remarkable speed. German attempts to establish defensive lines collapse under coordinated assaults of armor and infantry. Villages and towns fall in succession. Soviet cavalry divisions, operating in the traditional reconnaissance role but equipped with modern vehicles and supporting armor, probe German defenses for weakness and report back to commanders coordinating from mobile headquarters. The German concept of elastic defense, once a sophisticated tactical approach, has become impossible to execute. To employ elastic defense effectively, one requires strategic depth, room to withdraw, and establish new positions. Poland offers such depth, but only until one reaches the Oder River, the final barrier before the German heartland itself. More critically, elastic defense requires reserves that can be committed to new defensive lines. Germany possesses these reserves in increasingly insufficient numbers. Every soldier killed or captured is a soldier who cannot fight again. Every vehicle destroyed cannot be replaced. The German army is not merely losing ground, It is hemorrhaging capability with every day of combat. Zhukov remains in constant communication with his front commanders, moving between command posts by aircraft or fast military vehicles, observing conditions directly whenever possible. His role has transformed from that of crisis manager, responding to German attacks, into that of operational director, choreographing Soviet assaults. He is comfortable in this role, having developed it through years of experience. When reports arrive that Rokossovsky's forces have achieved deeper penetration than anticipated in one sector, Zhukov redirects resources to exploit that advantage. When Konyev's advance in the south temporarily falters against German resistance, Zhukov reinforces that sector with additional armor and motorized units. These decisions, made quickly based on incomplete information and communicated through the Soviet command system, have the effect of maintaining offensive momentum across the entire front. German commanders, by contrast, struggle with a system in which Hitler's paranoia prevents delegation of authority. Tank commanders must sometimes wait hours for authorization to commit reserves or adjust defensive positions. By the time approval arrives, circumstances have changed and the decision becomes obsolete. This fundamental difference in command structure, Soviet flexibility versus German rigidity, magnifies the advantage that Soviet numerical superiority already provides. The weather, harsh though it remains, cooperates with Soviet operations in unexpected ways. Temperature drops to 15 or 20 degrees below freezing in many areas, conditions that would normally paralyze armies. Yet snow actually benefits rapid mechanized advance more than resistance. The frozen earth supports the weight of tanks and vehicles, and snow cover actually reduces the dust clouds that would otherwise betray Soviet movements to German observers. Soviet soldiers, conditioned by the harsh Russian climate and equipped with winter clothing, function effectively in conditions that debilitate German troops, many of whom are inadequately clothed or acclimatized to extreme cold. Soviet supply lines, running primarily by rail through territories already secured, remain more resilient than German supply lines, increasingly vulnerable to Soviet air attack and partisan interference. The advantage in speed, supply, and soldier endurance all accumulates in favor of Soviet operations. German defenses, therefore, do not simply collapse from military incompetence, but from operating under conditions, logistical, climatic, and organizational, in which Soviet advantages compound into decisive superiority. By the beginning of February, Soviet forces have advanced across Poland to the Oder River itself, reaching positions within 90 kilometers of Berlin in some sectors. The Oder represents the final natural barrier before the Reich. Beyond the Oder lies German territory that has not experienced invasion in more than a century. The symbolism is not lost on Soviet soldiers, many of whom have marched westward for months watching German prisoners, destroyed German equipment, and liberated Soviet citizens from German occupation. The offensive has achieved in 3 weeks what German strategists considered impossible: the complete breakthrough of the Eastern Front and the positioning of Soviet forces at the gates of Germany itself. German casualties have been catastrophic. Estimates place German losses at more than 400,000 in killed, wounded, and captured. Soviet casualties, though lower than in some previous offensives, still amount to more than 100,000. Yet these losses, devastating as they are, tell only part of the story. The Vistula-Oder offensive represents more than battlefield victory. It represents the final demonstration of Soviet military superiority. Zhukov has orchestrated an operation of such magnitude and coordination that it has eliminated German capacity for serious resistance in the east. The Red Army now possesses the operational initiative completely. Every decision about future operations will be made in Moscow, by Soviet command, according to Soviet strategic interest. Germany will merely react, desperately and ineffectively, to Soviet actions. The offensive's conclusion at the Oder marks a psychological threshold as much as a geographical one. Soviet soldiers stand in German territory, aware that they are only days or weeks of further advance from Berlin itself. German civilian populations, seeing Soviet soldiers in their towns and villages, experience the invasion that 4 years of war had kept distant from German soil. Soviet command begins preparations for the final assault on Berlin itself, an operation that will require even greater coordination and concentration of force than what has already been achieved. Yet before that final blow can be delivered, time must pass. Soviet forces consolidate their positions on the Oder. Supply lines are extended and secured. Replacements arrive to bring divisions back to combat strength. The massive apparatus of Soviet military production and logistics grinds forward, preparing the Red Army for what will be the war's ultimate test, the assault on the German capital itself. Zhukov, observing his forces deployed along the Oder, understands that the war's outcome is now mathematically certain. The only questions remaining concern timing, casualties, and the scale of destruction inflicted upon German territory in final defeat. His strategic objective has been achieved. Soviet forces have driven westward across hundreds of kilometers, eliminated a German army group, liberated Soviet territory occupied for years, and positioned themselves for the final defeat of Nazi Germany. Yet Zhukov is not a man who celebrates prematurely. He has seen campaigns that appeared victorious turn into disaster through miscalculation or German desperation. He understands that Hitler remains capable of ordering senseless resistance that will consume lives on both sides. He recognizes that the final assault on Berlin will demand even more careful planning and coordination than previous operations. The Red Army stands at the threshold of its greatest victory. Yet that victory must still be seized and consolidated. Zhukov, the calculating strategist who has survived purge and adapted to total war, turns his attention toward the final challenge, the destruction of the Reich itself. By the spring of 1945, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov stood at the pinnacle of his power as a military commander, yet he faced a task that exceeded anything he had yet attempted. The war in Europe was collapsing toward its final convulsion, and Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, the seat of Hitler's Reich, lay within reach of Soviet forces. Zhukov had spent 4 years learning to orchestrate warfare at continental scale, but Berlin demanded something different: the annihilation of an enemy in its own capital, the subjugation of a city that had been hardened by years of bombing, yet remained defended by fanatical troops who understood they fought for their survival. The Red Army stood arrayed along the Oder River and the Vistula, having driven nearly 2,000 kilometers westward from the gates of Moscow. More than 2 million soldiers under Soviet command faced the final German strongholds, including perhaps 300,000 defenders of Berlin itself, Wehrmacht regulars, SS fanatics, Hitler Youth conscripts, and Berlin militia. The city itself had become a fortress, its streets transformed into killing grounds, its cellars into bunkers, its rubble into defensive positions. Everything that Zhukov had learned about mechanized warfare, about coordinating multiple fronts across vast distances, about logistics and deception and overwhelming force, would now be tested in the brutal intimacy of urban combat, where armor became vulnerable and infantry dominance reasserted itself in ways that had not been seen since the first weeks of Barbarossa. Zhukov's plan for the assault on Berlin represented the culmination of his strategic evolution. Unlike the massive tank concentrations that had characterized earlier offensives, the assault on Berlin required a different architecture of violence. Two massive Soviet army groups, the First Belarusian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev and the First Ukrainian Front further south, would drive toward Berlin from the east and southeast, their thrusts coordinated through constant communication with Zhukov, who served as Stalin's representative to the Red Army High Command. Zhukov understood that the final assault could not rely solely on armor and maneuver. The Wehrmacht, backed into its own territory, would fight with the ferocity of a trapped animal, and Berlin's urban terrain negated many of the advantages the Red Army had accumulated through 4 years of warfare. He therefore orchestrated an assault that emphasized overwhelming firepower, concentrated artillery bombardment, and the methodical compression of German forces into smaller and smaller pockets. The operation required coordination between multiple army groups, between different formations operating in extreme proximity to one another, and between mobile forces and infantry assault troops, a complexity that would have destroyed a lesser commander, but which Zhukov managed with the practiced authority of a man who had spent 4 years learning to conduct war on a continental scale. The assault began in the second week of April 1945, after Zhukov had positioned his forces and established supply lines capable of supporting millions of soldiers in sustained combat. The Soviet artillery bombardment that opened the campaign was unlike anything the world had yet witnessed in its concentrated fury. More than 40,000 artillery pieces, howitzers, mortars, anti-tank guns, and rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously across a front of roughly 50 kilometers, creating a wall of explosions that obscured the morning sky and transformed Berlin's eastern suburbs into a world of cratered earth and shattered masonry. Soviet sappers had spent weeks calculating firing coordinates and preparing ammunition dumps. The logistics of assembling and supplying such a concentration of firepower required the same meticulous planning that had characterized Operation Bagration. For hours, the bombardment continued, crushing German defensive positions, destroying command posts, and annihilating the Wehrmacht's forward trenches. When the barrage finally lifted, Soviet infantry advanced in waves across the Oder's crossings, moving through smoke so thick that visibility contracted to mere meters, making every movement an exercise in controlled chaos. The Germans responded with counterattacks and concentrated defensive fire, yet they lacked the reserves and firepower to halt the Soviet advance. The Red Army's sheer numerical superiority, supported by Zhukov's ruthless concentration of force, simply overwhelmed German defenses through attrition and pressure. Within days, Soviet forces had penetrated the outer defensive rings surrounding Berlin and were fighting in the city's suburbs. Zhukov now faced the challenge that had haunted military commanders throughout the war: urban combat, where the individual soldier became paramount, where tanks could be ambushed from ruined windows, where territory was measured in city blocks rather than kilometers. He responded by pushing more and more infantry into Berlin, while maintaining supporting armor and artillery positioned to provide covering fire and assault support. The fighting became a brutal, grinding affair. Soviet soldiers advancing through rubble-choked streets, clearing buildings room by room, supported by close air support from Soviet aviation and hammering artillery fire. German defenders, lacking reserves and trapped in their own capital, fought with a mixture of fanatical determination and hopelessness. Many were Hitler Youth conscripts barely old enough to shave, along with SS diehards who believed in fighting to the last man. Zhukov, operating from his command post outside the city, maintained tight control over the assault, throttling reinforcements forward as needed, maintaining pressure while managing the catastrophic casualties that urban warfare produced. Soviet losses were severe, thousands killed and wounded daily. Yet Zhukov accepted these losses as the price of total victory, understanding that the war was being decided street by street, building by building, and that every day Berlin remained unconquered, prolonged German resistance elsewhere on the continent. The psychological dimension of Berlin's fall added another layer to Zhukov's orchestration of the assault. German commanders understood that their capital's capture would effectively end the war, signaling total defeat and the collapse of any remaining hopes for a negotiated settlement. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, understood that Berlin represented the culmination of 4 years of warfare, the destruction of the regime that had invaded their homeland and murdered millions of their countrymen. Zhukov understood these psychological currents and used them to maintain momentum despite the grinding nature of urban combat. He ensured that Soviet troops received accurate information about German military collapse in other sectors, reinforcing the sense that Berlin was merely the final convulsion of a dying regime. He also managed the competition between Soviet commanders vying for the honor of capturing Berlin's symbolic centers, the Reichstag, the Brandenburg Gate, Hitler's bunker, recognizing that such competitions could spur aggressive action while also threatening to create dangerous confusion if not carefully controlled. Zhukov's management of these competing interests required not only military acumen but political sensitivity, understanding that victory in Berlin would have enormous implications for Soviet prestige and for Stalin's post-war positioning. By late April, Soviet forces had compressed German defenders into an ever-shrinking pocket centered on the city's western districts. The Reichstag, Berlin's symbolic center and the seat of German governmental authority, became the focus of Soviet assault operations. Zhukov directed multiple assault formations toward the Reichstag, resulting in fierce fighting in the building's massive stone corridors and vast chambers. German defenders, including fanatical SS troops and Wehrmacht holdouts, fought room by room, inflicting heavy casualties on Soviet attackers. Yet Soviet numbers and firepower proved overwhelming. The building was subjected to relentless artillery bombardment and close air support, while assault troops infiltrated through damaged walls and lower floors. On the 2nd of May, the Soviet flag was hoisted above the Reichstag, though fighting continued in Berlin's western districts for hours afterward. This symbolic victory was less about military significance than about psychological dominance. The image of the Soviet flag over Nazi Germany's most important symbol validated 4 years of Soviet sacrifice and proclaimed Soviet triumph to the world. Zhukov, who understood the importance of such symbols, ensured that the capture was properly documented and publicized, using it to maintain Soviet morale while simultaneously signaling to remaining German defenders that their cause was hopeless. As Soviet forces consolidated their grip on Berlin, the German military hierarchy disintegrated. Hitler, trapped in his underground bunker, removed himself from the world on the 30th of April, and German military commanders, recognizing that continued resistance was futile, began negotiating surrender terms with Soviet forces. Zhukov participated in these negotiations, representing Soviet military interests and ensuring that German surrender was unconditional and complete. On the 7th of May, German representatives signed an unconditional surrender document, bringing the war in Europe to its end after nearly 6 years of warfare. Zhukov, the peasant son from Strelkovka, who had risen to become the Soviet Union's greatest military commander, had orchestrated the final victory, coordinating millions of soldiers in the assault that ended the war in Europe. The achievement was undeniable and immense, yet Zhukov understood that the victory had been purchased at extraordinary cost. The battle for Berlin alone cost the Red Army more than 300,000 casualties, killed and wounded, in the final 2 weeks of fighting. The aftermath of Berlin's capture revealed the true dimensions of Soviet victory and the price that had been paid to achieve it. The city lay in ruins, reduced to rubble and ashes by years of bombing, and finally by the Soviet assault. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians had died in the fighting and bombardment, adding another tragic dimension to the war's conclusion. Soviet soldiers, having endured 4 years of warfare and having suffered staggering losses in their crusade across Europe, were now positioned as victors and occupiers of Germany. Zhukov moved through the devastated city, surveying the wreckage and understanding that the war that had consumed his military career was finally complete. He had transformed the Red Army from a partially broken instrument of a paranoid dictatorship into a continental military force capable of defeating Nazi Germany and conquering Eastern Europe. The vision that Stalin had articulated at the war's outset, the destruction of Nazism and the expansion of Soviet influence, had been realized, and Zhukov had been the principal architect of that realization. Yet even in the moment of victory, Zhukov understood that a new struggle was beginning. The Western Allies, who had liberated Western Europe, now confronted a Red Army that had conquered Eastern Europe and positioned itself to shape post-war Europe's configuration. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was already fracturing, and the peace that victory had brought was fundamentally unstable. Zhukov, as the Soviet general who had orchestrated the conquest of Eastern Europe, would now become the symbolic figure of Soviet military power in the post-war world. He had defeated Hitler's Germany, but greater challenges lay ahead, challenges that would test his political acumen far more severely than enemy armored formations ever had. The victory in Berlin was complete and total, yet it contained within it the seeds of future conflict. Stalin had launched Zhukov as his military instrument, and Zhukov had wielded that instrument with genius and ruthlessness. But the dictator would not tolerate indefinitely a general whose popularity and prestige rivaled his own authority. In capturing Berlin, Zhukov had reached the apex of his military career, but he had also set in motion the forces that would lead to his political decline. The war was over. The guns fell silent across the steppes and the ruins of 1,000 cities. Yet in that silence, something far heavier than artillery fire settled across the Soviet landscape, a weight that no amount of victory parades could lift. General Georgy Zhukov stood amid the wreckage of Eastern Europe in May of 1945, the architect of triumph staring into the abyss of what triumph had actually cost. Around him lay not just the defeated enemy, but the hollowed-out remnants of his own nation, a country that had paid more than any other power to break the back of Nazi Germany. The question that hung unspoken in that smoke-filled air was whether even the greatest military genius could justify such a price, and whether Zhukov himself had begun to understand the true magnitude of what his strategies had demanded. The numbers were almost too large to comprehend. More than 25 million Soviet citizens were dead, soldiers and civilians intermixed in casualty figures that defied ordinary human understanding. To place this in perspective, the entire population of a mid-sized nation had been erased from the earth. For every German soldier who fell on the Eastern Front, 3 or 4 Soviet soldiers had been killed alongside him. The Red Army had absorbed losses that would have destroyed any Western military force completely, yet it had not merely survived, it had grown stronger with each catastrophe, feeding fresh conscripts into the machinery of war, because the alternative was annihilation. Zhukov had orchestrated this grinding attrition with cold precision, calculating acceptable losses in terms of operational success. Yet now he was confronted with the actual human reality of those abstractions. Millions of mothers across the Soviet Union had received notices that their sons would not return. Millions of wives had become widows. Millions of children had become orphans in a nation already scarred by famine and revolution. Beyond the military dead lay an even more disturbing reality. The war had consumed not just soldiers but entire civilian populations, caught between advancing armies or deliberately targeted by occupiers. Leningrad had endured a 1,000-day siege that killed more than 1 million people through starvation and cold, a horror that Zhukov had witnessed firsthand without